Chapter 32 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. The Closing of the Gate. While Lady Graves was standing at the Broadmouth station on that Saturday in November, waiting for the London train, she saw a man whose face she knew and who saluted her with much humility. He was dressed in a semi-clerical fashion, in clothes made of smooth black cloth, and he wore a broad wide-awake, the only spot of color about him being a neck-scarf of brilliant red, whereof the strange incongruity caught and offended her eye. For a long time she puzzled herself with endeavors to recollect who this individual might be. He did not look like a farmer, and it was obvious that he could not belong to the neighboring clergy, since no parson in his senses would wear such a tie. Finally, Lady Graves concluded that he must be a dissenting minister, and dismissed the matter from her mind. At Liverpool Street, however, she saw him again, although he tried to avoid her, or so she thought. And then it flashed across her that this person was Mr. Samuel Rock of Moor Farm, and she wondered vaguely what his business in London could be. Had Lady Graves possessed the gift of clairvoyance, she would have wondered still more, for Mr. Rock's business was curiously connected with her own, seeing that he also had journeyed to town for the first time in his life in order to obtain an interview with Joan Haste, whose address he had purchased at so great a price on the previous day. As yet he had no very clear idea of what he should say or do when he found himself in Joan's presence. He knew only that he was driven to seek that presence by a desire which he was absolutely unable to control. He loved Joan, not as other men love, but with all the strength and virulence of his distempered nature, and this love or passion, or incipient insanity, drew him to her with as irresistible a force as a magnet draws the fragment of steel that is brought within its influence. Had he known her to be at the uttermost ends of the earth, it would have drawn him thither, and though he was timid and fearful of the vengeance of heaven, there was no danger that he would not have braved, and no crime which he would not have committed, that he might win her to himself. Till he learned to love Joan, Samuel Rock had been as free from all human affections as it is possible for a man to be. There was no one creature for whom he cared, and, though he was naturally passionate, his interest and his strict religious training had kept him from giving way to the excesses that in secret he brooded over and desired. During his early manhood, all his energies had been devoted to money-making, and in the joy of amassing wealth and of overreaching his fellows in every kind of legitimate business, he found consolation for the absence of all that in the case of most men makes life worth living. Then on one evil day he met Joan, grown from a child into a most lovely woman, and that which he had hidden in his heart arose suddenly and asserted itself, so that from this hour he became a slave bound to the chariot wheels of a passion over which he had lost command. The rebuffs that he had received at her hands served only to make the object of his affections dearer and more desirable in his eyes, while the gnawing ache of jealousy and the daily torment of long-continued disappointment drove him by slow degrees to the very edge of madness. She hated him, he knew, as he knew that she loved his rival, but if only he could see her, things might go well with him, or if they did not, at least he would have seen her. But of all this Lady Graves was ignorant, and, had she known it, anxious though she was to win her end, it is probable that she would have shrunk from an enterprise which, if successful, must expose Joan Haste to the persecution of such a man as Samuel Rock, and might end in delivering her into his hands. On the following afternoon, it was Sunday, Lady Graves informed her hostess that she was going to visit a friend, and, declining the offer of the carriage, walked to the corner of the square, where she chartered a four-wheeled cab, directing the driver to take her to Kent Street. As they crawled up the Edgware Road, she let down the window of the cab and idly watched the stream of passers-by. Presently she started, for among the hundreds of faces she caught sight of that of Mr. Samuel Rock. It was pale, and she noticed that as he went, the man was muttering to himself and glancing at the corner of a street, as though he were seeking some turn with which he was not familiar. "I wonder what that person is doing here," she thought to herself. "Positively he seems to haunt me." Then the cab went on, and presently drew up in front of No. 8, Kent Street. What a squalid-looking place, Lady Graves reflected, while she paid the man and rang the bell. As it chanced, Mrs. Bird was out, and the door was answered by the little serving girl, who, in reply to the question of whether Miss Haste was in, said yes without hesitation, and led the way upstairs. "Someone to see you," she said, opening the door in front of Lady Graves, and almost simultaneously shutting it behind her. Joan, who was seated on the horsehair sofa reading, or pretending to read a book, rose instinctively at the words, and stared at her veiled and stately-looking visitor. "Surely," she said, "you are Lady Graves?" "Yes, Miss Haste, I am Lady Graves, and I have taken the liberty of coming to see you. I am told that you have been ill." Joan bowed her head and sank back upon the sofa, pointing towards a chair. At the moment she could not trust herself to speak, for she felt that the blow which she dreaded was about to fall, and that Henry's mother came as a messenger of ill. Lady Graves sat down, and for a while there was silence. "I trust that you are better?" she said at length. "Thank you, yes, your ladyship. I am almost well again now." "I am glad of that, Miss Haste, for I do not wish to upset you or retard your recovery, and I have come to speak to you, if I have your permission, upon a very delicate and important matter." Again Joan bowed, and Lady Graves went on. "Miss Haste, certain things have come to my knowledge of which I need only allude to one, namely, that my son Henry is anxious to make you his wife, as indeed, if what I have learned is true, you have a right to expect." And she paused. "Please go on," murmured Joan. "I am here," she continued hesitatingly, "to submit some questions to your consideration, but pray understand that my son knows nothing of this visit, and that I have not come to reproach you in any way. We are all human and liable to fall into temptation, though our temptations vary with age, disposition, and other circumstances. It is quite possible, for instance, that in speaking to you thus I am at this moment yielding to a temptation which I ought to resist. Perhaps I am right in supposing that it is your intention to accept my son's offer of marriage?" "I have not made up my mind, Lady Graves." "Well," she answered with a faint smile, "you will doubtless make it up when you see him, if you do see him. I think that I may take it for granted that, unless what I have to say to you should change your views, you will very shortly be married to Sir Henry Graves." "I suppose you do not wish that," said Joan. "Indeed, how can you wish it, seeing what I am, and his reason for asking me to marry him?" "No, I do not wish it, though not altogether for these reasons. You are a very beautiful woman, and a sweet one, and I have no doubt that you could soon learn to fill any position which he might be able to give you, with credit to yourself and to him. As for the rest, he is as much to blame as you are, and therefore owes you reparation, so I will say no more upon that point. My reasons are simple, and to a certain extent selfish, but I think that they will appeal to you. I believe that you love Henry. Well, if you marry him, you will bring this man whom you love to the most irretrievable ruin. I do not know if you have heard of it, but the place where he lives, and where his ancestors have lived for 3 centuries before him, is deeply encumbered. Should he marry a girl without means, it must be sold, leaving us all, not only beggars, but bankrupt. I will not insult you by supposing that the fact that you would find yourself in the painful position of the penniless wife of a person of nominal rank can influence you one way or another. But I do hope that the thought of the position in which he would find himself may influence you. He would be driven from his home, his name would be tarnished, and he would be left burdened with a wife and family, and without a profession, to seek such a living as chance might offer to him." "I know all this," said Joan quietly, "but have you quite considered my side of the question, Lady Graves? You seem to have heard the facts. Have you thought, then, in what state I shall be left if I refuse the offer that Sir Henry has so generously made to me?" "Doubtless," answered Lady Graves confusedly. "Forgive me for speaking of it. Adequate provision, the best possible, would be made—" She stopped, for Joan held up her hand in warning, and said, "If you are going to offer me money compensation, I may as well tell you at once. It is the one thing that I shall not be able to forgive you. Also, where is the provision to come from? Do you wish to endow me with Miss Levenger's money? I have not sunk to that, Lady Graves." "I ask your pardon," she answered. "It is so terribly hard to deal with such a subject without giving offense. Believe me, I have considered your side of the question, and my heart bleeds for you, for I am asking more of you than anyone has a right to ask of a woman placed in your position. Indeed, I have come to you as a suppliant, not for justice, but for pity, to implore you, in the name of the love which you bear my son, to save him from himself, yes, even at the cost of your own ruin." "You put things plainly, Lady Graves, but how if he loves me? In that event, will it be any real kindness to save him from himself? Naturally, I do not wish to sacrifice my life for nothing." "It will be a kindness, Miss Haste, if not to him, at any rate to his family. To the chance that a man in after years might learn to dislike, or even to hate the woman who has been forced upon him as a wife under such painful circumstances, I will only allude, for although it is a common experience enough, it is possible, indeed I think that it is probable, that such a thing would never arise in your case. If he loves you, in my opinion, he should sacrifice that love upon the altar of his duty. He has sinned, and it is right that he should suffer for his sin, as you have already suffered. Although I am his mother, Miss Haste, for Henry I have little sympathy in this matter. My sympathy is for you, and you alone. You spoke of his family, Lady Graves. A man is not his family. Surely his duty is towards himself, and not towards the past and the future. I cannot agree with you. The duty of a man placed as Henry is chiefly owing to the house which for some few years he represents, in which, indeed, he has but a brief life interest, and to the name that has descended to him. The step which he contemplates would bring both to destruction. Also it would bring me, his mother, who have given my all to bolster up the fortunes of his family, to utter penury in my old age. But of that I do not complain. I am well schooled in trouble, and it makes little difference to me in what fashion I drag out my remaining years. I plead, Miss Haste, not for myself and not for my son Henry, but for his forefathers and his descendants, and the home that for 3 centuries has been theirs. Do you know how his father, my beloved husband, died? He died broken-hearted, because in his last moments he learned that his only surviving son purposed to sacrifice all these on your account. Therefore, although he is dead, I plead for him also. Putting Henry out of the account, this is the plain issue, Miss Haste. Are you to be deserted, or is Rosham to be sold, and are the members of the family into which I have married to be turned out upon the world bankrupt and dishonored? Putting myself aside, Lady Graves, is your son to suffer for difficulties that he did not create? Did he spend the money, which if it is not repaid will make him a bankrupt? Indeed, will he be made a bankrupt at all? Was he not earning his living in a profession which his family forced him to abandon in order that he might take these troubles upon his own shoulders, and put an end to them by bartering himself in marriage to a rich lady for whom he has no affection? These things are true, but still I say that he must suffer, and for the reasons that I have given. You say that, Lady Graves, but what you mean is that he will not suffer. I will put your thoughts into words. You think that your son has been betrayed by me into a troublesome position from which most men would escape simply enough, namely by deserting the woman. As it chances, he is so foolish that, when he has heard of her trouble, he refuses to do this from a mistaken sense of honor. So you come to appeal to that fallen and unfortunate woman, although it must be an insult to you to be obliged even to speak to her, and because you are kind-hearted, you say that your son must suffer. How must he suffer according to your view? His punishment will be, firstly, that at the cost of some passing pain he escapes from a disgraceful marriage with a nameless girl, a half-lady, born of nobody knows whom, and bred up in a public house, with such results that on the first opportunity she follows her mother's example, and secondly, that he must marry a sweet and beautiful lady, who will bring him love as well as fortune, and having shaken himself clear from trouble of every sort, live happy and honored in the position that he has inherited. And if, as you wish, I inflict all this upon him by refusing to marry him, what will be my reward? A life of shame and remorse for myself and my unborn child, till at length I die of a broken heart, or perhaps—" and she stopped. "Oh, how can I ask it of you?" broke in Lady Graves. "I do not know. That is a matter for your own conscience. But you have asked it, understanding all that it means to me. Well, Lady Graves, I will do as you wish. I will not accept your son's offer. He never made me a promise of marriage, and I never asked or expected any. Whatever I have done, I did for love of him, and it was my fault, not his, or as much my fault as his, and I must pay the price. I love him so well that I sacrifice my child and myself, that I put him out of my life, yes, and give him to the arms of my rival." And Joan made a movement with her hands, as though to push away some unseen presence. "You are a very noble woman," said Lady Graves, "so noble that my mind misgives me, and notwithstanding all that I have said, I am inclined to ask you to forget that promise and let things take their chance. Whatever may have been your faults, no man could do wrong to marry such a wife. No, I have promised, and there's an end, and may God have mercy on me, for he alone knows how I shall perform what now I undertake. Forgive me, your ladyship, but I am very tired." Then her visitor rose. "My dear girl," she said, "my dear, dear girl, in asking all of this of you, I have done only what I believe to be my duty, and should you, on reflection, come to any different conclusion from that which you have just expressed, I can only say that I, for one, shall not blame you, and that, whatever the event, you will always have me for your friend." And moved to it by a sudden impulse, she bent down and kissed Joan upon the forehead. "Thank you," said Joan, smiling faintly. "You are too good to me. Do not distress yourself. I dare say that I should have come to the same mind if I had not seen you, and I deserve it all." Then Lady Graves went. It was very painful, she reflected as she left the house. That girl has a heart of gold, and I feel as though I had done something wicked, though heaven knows that I am acting for the best. Why, there's that man Rock again, staring at the house. What can he be looking for? Somehow I don't like him. His face and manner remind me of a cat watching a caged bird. Joan watched the door close behind Lady Graves. Then, pressing her hands to her head, she began to laugh hysterically. "It is like a scene out of a book," she said aloud. "Well, the dream has come to an end, sooner than I thought even. I knew it would, so what does it matter? And now what am I to do?" She thought a while, then went to the table and began to write. She wrote thus: "Dear Sir Henry, I have received your letter, but could not answer it before because I was so ill. I am very much honored by what you say in it, but it is not to be thought of that a gentleman in your position should marry a poor girl like me, and if you did, I dare say that we should both of us be very unhappy, seeing that, as they say in Broadmouth, pigeons can't nest with crows. It seems, from what you tell me, that I have written you some stuff while I was ill. I remember nothing about it, but if so, you must pay no attention to it, since people often talk and write nonsense when they are off their heads. You will be glad to know that I hope to get well again soon, but I am still too sick to see anybody at present, so it will be no use your coming to London to call upon me. I do not mind my life here at all, and hope to find another situation as soon as I can get about. Thanking you again, believe me, your affectionate, Joan. P.S. You must not take any notice of what Mrs. Bird writes, as she is very romantic. I cannot help thinking how sorry you would be if I were to take you at your word. Just fancy Sir Henry Graves married to a shop girl." Joan gave much thought and care to the composition of this precious epistle, with the result that it was in its way a masterpiece of art. Indeed, just the kind of letter that a person of her position and bringing up might be expected to write to a former flame of whom, for reasons of her own, she wished to see no more. "There," she said, as she finished rereading her fair copy. "If that does not disgust him with me, I don't know what will. Bah! It makes me sick myself. Oh, my darling, it is bitter hard that I should have to write to you like this. I know that I shall not be able to keep it up for long. Some day I shall see you and tell you the truth, but not till you are married, dear." And she rested her head, that now was clustered over with little curls, upon the edge of the table and wept bitterly, till she heard the girl coming up with her tea, when she dried her eyes and sent her letter to the post. Thus, then, did Joan begin to keep her promise. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. The Gate of Hell. On the afternoon of the day following the interview between Lady Graves and Joan, it occurred to Henry, who chanced to be in Broadmouth, that he might as well call at the post office to get any letters which had been dispatched from London on the Sunday. There was but one, and recognizing the handwriting on the envelope, he read it eagerly as he sat upon his horse. Twice did he read it, then he put it in his pocket and rode homewards wondering, for as yet he could scarcely believe that it had been written by Joan Haste. There was nothing in the letter itself that he could find fault with, yet the tone of it disgusted him. It was vulgar and flippant. Could the same hand have written these words, and those other words, incoherent and yet so touching, that had stirred his nature to its depths? And if so, which of them reflected the true mind of the writer? The first letter was mad, but beautiful. The second sane, but to his sense shocking. If it was genuine, he must conclude that the person who penned it desired to have done with him. But was it genuine? He could not account for the letter, and yet he could not believe in it. For if Joan wrote it of her own free will, then indeed he had misinterpreted her character and thrown his pearls, such as they were, before the feet of swine. She had been ill, she might have fallen under other influences. He would not accept his dismissal without further proof, at any rate until he had seen her and was in a position to judge for himself. And yet he must send an answer of some sort. In the end he wrote thus: "Dear Joan, I have received your note, and I tell you frankly that I cannot understand it. You say that you do not wish to marry me, which, unless I have altogether misunderstood the situation, as may be the case, seems incomprehensible to me. I still purpose to come to town on Friday, when I hope that you will be well enough to see me, and to talk this matter over. Affectionately yours, Henry Graves." Joan received this note in due course of post. Just what I expected, she thought. How good he is. Most people would have had nothing more to do with me after that horrid common letter. How am I to meet him if he comes? I cannot, simply I cannot. I should tell him all the truth, and where would my promise be then? If I see him, I shall marry him. That is, if he wishes it. I must not see him. I must go away. But where can I go? Oh, heaven help me, for I cannot help myself. The journey to London had not changed Mr. Samuel Roch's habits, which it will be remembered were of a furtive nature. When Lady Graves saw him on the Sunday, he was employed in verifying the information as to Joan's address that he had obtained from Mrs. Gillingwater. Any other man would have settled the matter by inquiring at number 8 as to whether or not she lived there, but he preferred to prowl up and down in the neighborhood of the house till chance assured him of the fact. As it happened, fortune favored him from the outset, for if Lady Graves saw him, he also saw her as she left the house, and was not slow to draw conclusions from her visit, though what its exact object might be he could not imagine. One thing was clear, however. Mrs. Gillingwater had not lied, since to suppose that by the merest coincidence Lady Graves was calling at this particular house for some purpose unconnected with Joan Haste was an idea too improbable to be entertained. Still, his suspicious mind was not altogether satisfied. For aught he knew, Joan had left the place, or possibly she might be dead. In his desire to solve his doubts on these points before he committed himself to any overt act, Samuel returned on the Monday morning to Kent Street from the hotel where he had taken a room, and set himself to watch the windows of number 8, but without results, for the fog was so thick that he could see nothing distinctly. In the afternoon, when the fog lifted, he was more successful, for just as the November evening was closing in, the gas was lit in the front room on the first floor, and for a minute he caught a glimpse of Joan herself drawing down a blind. The sight of her filled him with a strange rapture, and he hesitated a while as to whether he should seek an interview with her at once or wait until the morrow. In the end he decided upon the latter course, both because his courage failed him at the moment, and because he wished to think over his plan of action. On the Tuesday morning he returned about 10 o'clock, and with many inward tremblings rang the bell of number 8. The door was answered by Mrs. Bird, whom he saluted with the utmost politeness, standing on the step with his hat off. "Pray, ma'am, is Miss Haste within?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Being so ill, she has not been out for many weeks." "So I have heard, ma'am, and I think that you are the lady who has nursed her so kindly." "I have done my best, sir, but what might be your errand?" "I wish to see her, ma'am." Mrs. Bird looked at him doubtfully and shook her head. "I don't think that she can see anyone at present, unless, indeed, you are the gentleman from Bradmouth whom she expects." An inspiration flashed into Samuel's mind. "I am the gentleman from Bradmouth," he answered. Again Mrs. Bird scanned him curiously. To her knowledge she had never set eyes upon a baronet, but somehow Samuel did not fulfill her idea of a person of that class. He seemed too humble, and she felt that there was something wrong about the red tie and the broad black hat. Perhaps he is disguising himself, she thought. Baronets and earls often do that in books, then added aloud, "Are you Sir Henry Graves?" By now Samuel understood that to hesitate was to lose all chance of seeing Joan. His aim was to obtain access to the house. Once there, it would be difficult to force him to leave until he had spoken to her. After all, he could only be found out, and if he waited for another opportunity, it was obvious that his rival, who was expected at any moment, would be beforehand with him. Therefore he lied boldly, answering, "That is my name, ma'am, Sir Henry Graves of Rosham." Mrs. Bird asked him into the passage and shut the door. "I didn't think that you would be here till Friday, sir," she said, "but I dare say that you are a little impatient, and that your mother told you that Joan is well enough to see you now," for Mrs. Bird had heard of Lady Graves' visit, though Joan had not spoken to her of its object. "Yes, ma'am, you are right. I am impatient, very impatient." "That is as it should be, sir, seeing all the lost time you have to make up for. Well, the past is the past, and you are acting like a gentleman now, which can never be a sorrow to you, come what may." "Quite so, ma'am. But where's Joan?" "She is in that room at the top of the stairs, sir. Perhaps you would like to go to her now. I know that she is up and dressed, for I have just left her. I do not think that I will come with you, seeing that you might feel it awkward, both of you, if a third party was present at such a meeting. You can tell me how you got on when you come down." "Thank you, ma'am," said Samuel again. And then he crept up the stairs, his heart filled with fear, hope, and raging jealousy of the man he was personating. Arriving at the door, he knocked upon it with a trembling hand. Joan, who was reading Henry's note for the 10th time, heard the knock, and having hastily hidden the paper in her pocket, said, "Come in," thinking that it was her friend the doctor, for she had caught the sound of a man's voice in the passage. In another moment the door had opened and shut again, and she was on her feet staring at her visitor with angry, frightened eyes. "How did you come here, Mr. Roch?" she said in a choked voice. "How dare you come here?" "I dare to come here, Joan," he answered with some show of dignity, Because I love you. Oh, I beg of you, do not drive me away until you have heard me. And indeed it would be useless, for I shall only wait in the street till I can speak to you. You know that I do not wish to hear you, she answered, and it is cowardly of you to hunt me down when I am weak and ill, as though I were a wild beast. I understand, Joan, that you are not too ill to see Sir Henry Graves. Surely, then, you can listen to me for a few minutes. And as for my being cowardly, I do not care if I am, though why a man should be called a coward because he comes to ask the woman he loves to marry him, I can't say. To marry you! Exclaimed Joan, turning pale and sinking back into her chair. I thought that we had settled all that long ago, Mr. Rock, out by the Bradmouth Meres. We spoke of it, Joan, but we did not settle it. We both grew angry and said and did things which had best be forgotten. You swore that you would never marry me, and I swore that you should live to beg me to marry you, for you drove me mad with your cruel words. We were wrong, both of us, so let's wipe all that out, for I believe I shall marry you, Joan, and I know that you will never plead with me to do it, nor would I wish it so. Oh, hear me, hear me. You don't know what I have suffered since I lost you, but I tell you that I have been filled with all the tortures of hell. I have thought of you by day and dreamed of you by night, till I began to believe my brain would burst and that I must go mad, as I shall do if I lose you altogether. At last I heard that you had been ill and got your address, and now once more I come to pray you to take pity on me and promise to be my wife. If only you will do that, I swear to you I will be the best husband that ever a woman had. Yes, I will make myself your slave, and you shall want for nothing which I can give you. I do not ask your love. I do not even ask that you should treat me kindly. Deal with me as you will, be bitter and scornful and trample me in the dirt, and I will be content if only you will let me live where I can see you day by day. This isn't a new thing with me, Joan. It has gone on for years, and now it has come to this, that either I must get the promise of you or go mad. Then do not drive me away, but have mercy as you hope for mercy. Pity me and consent. And with an inarticulate sound that was half a sob and half a groan, he flung himself upon his knees, and clasping his hands, looked up at her with a rapt face like that of a man lost in earnest prayer. Joan listened, and as she listened, a new and terrible idea crept into her mind. Here, if she chose to take it, if she could bring herself to take it, was an easy path out of her difficulty. Here was that which would effectually cure Henry of any desire to ruin himself by marrying her, and would put her beyond the reach of temptation. The thought made her faint and sick, but still she entertained it. So desperate was the case between her love and what she conceived to be her duty. If it could be done with certain safeguards and reservations, why should it not be done? This man was in a humor to consent to anything. It was but a question of the sacrifice of her miserable self, whereby, so they said, and so she believed, she would save her lover. In a minute she had made up her mind. At least she would sound the man and put the matter to proof. Do not kneel to me, she said, breaking the silence. You do not know what sort of woman it is to whom you are groveling. Get up, and now listen. I love another man, and if I love another man, what do you think that my feelings are to you? I think that you hate me, but I do not mind that. In time you would come to care for me. I doubt it, Mr. Rock. I cannot change my heart so easily. Do you know what terms I stand on with this man? If you mean Sir Henry Graves, I have heard plenty of all that, and I am ready to forgive you. You are very generous, Mr. Rock, but perhaps I had better explain a little. I think it probable that, unless I change my mind, within a week I shall be married to Sir Henry Graves. Oh, my God, he groaned, I never thought that he would marry you. Well, as it happens, he will. That is, if I consent. And now do you know why? He shook his head. Then I will tell you, so that you may understand exactly about the woman whom you wish to make your wife. Do not think that I am putting myself in your power, for in the first place, if you use my words against me, I shall deny them, and in the second, I shall be married to Sir Henry and able to defy you. This is the reason, Mr. Rock. And she bent forward and told him all in a few words, speaking in a low, clear voice. Samuel's face turned livid as he heard. The villain, he muttered. Oh, I should like to kill him. The villain, the villain. Don't talk in that kind of way, Mr. Rock, or if you wish to do so, leave me. Why should you call him a villain, seeing that he loves me as I love him, and is ready to marry me tomorrow? Are you prepared to do as much now? Stop before you answer. You have not heard all the terms upon which, even if you should still wish it, I might possibly consent to become your wife, or my reason for even considering the matter. First, as to the reason, it would be that I might protect Sir Henry Graves from the results of his own good feeling, for it cannot be to his advantage to burden his life with me, and unless I take some such step or die, I shall probably marry him. Now, as to the condition upon which I might consent to marry anybody else, you, for instance, Mr. Rock, It is that I should be left alone to live here or wherever I might select for a year from the present date, unless of my own free will I chose to shorten the time. Do you think that you or any other man, Mr. Rock, could consent to take a woman upon such terms?" "What would happen at the end of the year?" he asked. "At the end of the year," she answered deliberately, "if I still lived, I should be prepared to become the faithful wife of that man, provided, of course, that he did not attempt to violate the agreement in any particular. If he chose to do so, I should consider the bargain at an end, and he would never see me again." "You want to drive a hard trade, Joan." "Yes, Mr. Rock, a very hard trade. But then, you see, the circumstances are peculiar." "It's too much. I can't see my way to it, Joan," he exclaimed passionately. "I am very glad to hear that, Mr. Rock," she answered, with evident relief, "and I think that you are quite right. Good-bye." Samuel picked up his hat and rose as though to go. "Shall you marry him?" he said hoarsely. "I do not see that I am bound to answer that question, but it is probable. For my own sake, I hope so." He took a step towards the door, then turned suddenly and dashed his hat upon the carpet. "I can't let you go to him," he said with an oath. "I'll take you upon your own terms, if you'll give me no better ones." "Yes, Mr. Rock, but how am I to know that you will keep those terms?" "I'll swear it, but if I swear, when will you marry me?" "Whenever you like, Mr. Rock. There's a Bible on the table. If you are in earnest, take it and swear, for then I know you will be afraid to break your oath." Samuel picked up the book and swore thus at her dictation. "I swear that for a year from the date of my marrying you, Joan Haste, I will not attempt to see you, but will leave you to go your own way without interfering with you by word or deed, upon the condition that you have nothing to do with Sir Henry Graves." This sentence was Samuel's own. "And that at the end of the year you come to me to be my faithful wife." And, kissing the book, he threw it down upon the table, adding, "And may God blast me if I break this oath. Do you believe me now, Joan?" "On second thoughts, I am not sure that I do," she answered, with a contemptuous smile, "for I think that the man who can take that vow would also break it. But if you do break it, remember what I tell you, that you will see no more of me. After all, this is a free country, Mr. Rock, and even though I become your wife in name, you cannot force me to live with you. There is one more thing. I will not be married to you in a church. I will be married before a registrar, if at all." "I suppose that you must have your own way about that too, Joan, though it seems an unholy thing not to ask heaven's blessing on us." "There is likely to be little enough blessing about the business," she answered, then added, touched by compunction, "You had best leave it alone, Mr. Rock. It is wicked and wrong from beginning to end, and you know that I don't love you, nor ever shall, and the reasons why I consent to take you. Be wise and have done with me, and find some other woman who has no such history who will care for you and make you a good wife." "No, Joan, you have promised to do that much when the time comes, and I believe you. No other woman could make up to me for the loss of you, not if she were an angel." "So be it then," she answered, "but do not blame me if you are unhappy afterwards, for I have warned you, and however much I may try to do my duty, it can't make up to a man for the want of love. And now, when is it to be?" "You said whenever I liked, Joan, and I say the sooner we are married, the sooner the year of waiting will be over. If it can be done, tomorrow or the next day, as I think for you have been living a long while in this parish, I will go and make arrangements, and come to tell you." "Don't do that, Mr. Rock, as I can't talk any more today. Send me a telegram, and now, good-bye. I want to rest." He waited for her to offer him her hand, but she did not do so. Then he turned and went, walking so softly that until she heard the front door close, Mrs. Bird was unaware that he had left the room above. Throwing down her work, she ran upstairs, for her curiosity would not allow her to delay. Joan was seated on the sofa, staring out of the window, with wide-open eyes and a face so set that it might have been cut in stone. "Well, my dear," said the little woman, "so you have seen Sir Henry, and I hope that you have arranged everything satisfactorily?" Joan heard and smiled. Even then it struck her as ludicrous that Mrs. Bird could possibly mistake Samuel Rock for Sir Henry Graves. But she did not attempt to undeceive her, since to do so would have involved long explanations, on which at the moment she had neither the wish nor the strength to enter. Moreover, she was sure that Mrs. Bird would disapprove of this strange contract, and oppose it with all her force. Even then, however, she could not help reflecting how oddly things had fallen out. It was as though some superior power were smoothing away every difficulty, and, to fulfill secret motives of its own, was pushing her into this hideous and shameful union. For instance, though she had never considered it, had not Mrs. Bird fatuously taken it for granted that her visitor must be Sir Henry and no other man, it was probable that she would have found means to prevent him from seeing her, or, failing that, she would have put a stop upon the project by communicating with Henry. For a moment Joan was tempted to tell her the truth, and let her do what she would, in the hope that she might save her from herself. But she resisted the desire, and answered simply, Yes, I shall probably be married tomorrow or the next day. Tomorrow! Ejaculated Mrs. Bird, holding up her hands. Why, you haven't even got a dress ready. I can do without that, she replied, especially as the ceremony is to be before a registrar. Before a registrar, Joan? Why, if I did such a thing, I should never feel half married. Besides, it's wicked. Perhaps, said Joan, smiling again, but it is the only fashion in which it can be arranged, and it will serve our turn. By the way, shall you mind if I come back to live here afterwards? What, with your husband? There would not be room for two of you. Besides, a baronet could never put up with a place like this. No, without him. We are going to keep separate for a year. Good heavens, exclaimed Mrs. Bird. What an extraordinary arrangement. There are difficulties, Mrs. Bird, and it is the only one that we could come to. I suppose that I can stay on? Oh, yes, if you like, but I really do not understand. I can't explain it just at present, dear, said Joan gently. I am too tired. You will know all about it soon. Well, thought Mrs. Bird as she left the room, somehow I don't like that baronet so much as I did. It is all so odd and secret. I hope that he doesn't mean to deceive Joan with a false marriage and then to desert her. I have heard of people of rank doing such things. But if he tries it on, he will have to reckon with me. That afternoon Joan received the following telegram. All arranged. Will call for you at 2 the day after tomorrow. Samuel. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. The Opening of the Gate. It was 1:45 on the Thursday, and Joan, dressed in the black silk gown that she used to wear when on duty at Messrs. Black & Parker's, awaited the arrival of her intended husband in the little sitting-room, where presently Mrs. Bird joined her, attired in a lilac dress and a bonnet with white flowers and long tulle strings. "What, my dear, are you going to be married in black? Pray don't. It is so unlucky." "It is the best dress that I have," answered Joan. "There's a pretty gray one." "No," she replied hastily, "I will not wear that. Besides, the black one is more suitable." "Joan, Joan," cried Mrs. Bird, "is everything right? You don't look as you ought to, not a bit happy." "Quite right, thank you," she answered with an unmoved countenance. "I have been shut up for so long that the idea of going out upsets me a little, that is all." Then Mrs. Bird collapsed and sat silent, but Joan, moving to the window, looked down the street. The sight was not an inspiriting one, for it was a wet and miserable afternoon, even for London in November, and the rain trickled ceaselessly down the dirty window-panes. Presently through the mist Joan saw a four-wheeled cab advancing towards the house. "Come," she said, "here it is." And she put on a heavy cloak over her other wrappings. At the door she paused for a moment, as though her resolution failed her, then passed downstairs with a steady step. Mr. Rock was already in the passage, inquiring for her from Maria. "Here I am," she said. "Let us go at once. I am afraid of catching cold if I stand about." Apparently Samuel was too much taken aback to make any answer, and in another minute they were all three in the cab, driving towards the nearest registry. "I managed it all right, Joan," he said, bending forward and raising his voice to make himself heard above the rattling of the crazy cab. "I was only just in time, though, for I had to give 48 hours clear notice at the registry, and to make all sorts of affidavits about your age, and as to your having been resident in the parish for more than 15 days. Joan received this information in silence, and nothing more was said until they arrived at the office. From that moment till the end of the ceremony, so far as her immediate surroundings were concerned, Joan's mind was very much of a blank. She remembered indeed standing before a pleasant-looking gentleman with gold spectacles and a bald head, who asked her certain questions which she answered. She remembered also that Samuel put a ring upon her finger, for she noticed how his long white hands shook as he did so, and their hateful touch for a few instants stirred her from her lethargy. Then there arose in her mind a vision of herself standing on a golden summer afternoon by the ruins of an ancient church, and of one who spoke to her and whom she must never see again. The vision passed, and she signed something. While her pen was yet upon the paper, she heard Mrs. Bird exclaim in a shrill, excited voice, "I forbid it! There's fraud here, as I believed all along. I thought that he used the wrong name, and now he's gone and signed it." "What do you mean, madam?" asked the registrar. "Pray explain yourself." "I mean that he is deceiving this poor girl into a false marriage. His name is Sir Henry Graves, Bart, and he has signed himself there Samuel Rock." "The good lady is under a mistake," explained Samuel, clasping his hands and writhing uncomfortably. "My name is Rock, and I am a farmer, not a baronet." Well, I must say, sir, answered the registrar, that you look as little like the one as the other. But this is a serious matter, so perhaps your wife will clear it up. She ought to know who and what you are, if anybody does. He is Mr. Samuel Rock, of the Moor Farm, Bradmouth, Joan answered, in an impassive voice. My friend here is mistaken. Sir Henry Graves is quite a different person. Mrs. Bird heard, and sank into a chair speechless, nor did she utter another syllable until she found herself at home again. Then the business went on, and presently the necessary certificates, of which Samuel was careful to obtain certified copies, were filled in and signed, and the party left the office. There's something odd about that affair, said the registrar to his assistant, as he entered the amount of the fee received in a ledger, and I shouldn't wonder if Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Rock make their appearance in the courts before they are much older. However, all the papers are in order, so they can't blame me. What a pretty woman she is, but she looked very sad and ill. In the waiting-room of the office, Joan held out her hand to Samuel and said, "Good-bye." "Mayn't I see you home?" he asked piteously. She shook her head and answered, "On this day year, if I am alive, you may see as much of me as you like, but till then we are strangers," and she moved towards the door. He stretched out his arms as though to embrace her, but followed by the bewildered Mrs. Bird, she swept past him, and soon they were driving back to Kent Street, leaving Samuel standing bareheaded upon the pavement in the rain and gazing after her. In the passage of number 8, Sally was waiting to present Joan with a bouquet of white flowers that she had found no opportunity to give her as she went out. Joan took the flowers and, bending down, kissed the dumb child, and that kiss was the only touch of nature in all the nefarious and unnatural business of her marriage. Mrs. Bird followed her upstairs, and so soon as the door was closed, said, "For pity's sake, Joan, tell me what all this means. Am I mad, or are you?" "I am, Mrs. Bird," she answered. "If you want to know, I have married this man, who has been in love with me a long while, but whom I hate, in order to prevent Sir Henry Graves from making me his wife." "But why, Joan? But why?" Mrs. Bird gasped. "Because if I had married Sir Henry, I should have ruined him, and also because I promised Lady Graves that I would not do so. Had I once seen him, I should have broken my promise, so I have taken this means to put myself out of temptation, having first told Mr. Rock the whole truth, and bargained that I should not go to live with him for another year." "Oh, this is terrible, terrible," said Mrs. Bird, wringing her hands. "And what a reptile the man must be to marry you on such terms, and knowing that you loathe the sight of him." "Do not abuse him, Mrs. Bird, for on the whole I think that he is as much wronged as anybody. At least he is my husband, whom I have taken with my eyes open, as he has taken me." "He may be your husband, but he is a liar for all that, for he told me that he was Sir Henry Graves, and that is why I let him come up to see you, although I thought from the look of him that he couldn't be a baronet. Well, Joan, you have done it now, and as you've sown, so you will have to reap. The wages of sin is death, that's the truth of it. You've gone wrong, and like many another, you have got to suffer. I don't believe in your arguments that have made you marry this crawling creature. They are a kind of lie, and like all lies, they will bring misery. You have a good heart, but you've never disciplined it, and a heart without discipline is the most false of guides. It isn't for me to reproach you, Joan. Who am I dare say, 10 times worse than you are, but I can't hold with your methods. However, you are married to this man now, so if you're wise, you'll try to make the best of him and forget the other." "Yes," she answered, "I shall if I am wise, or if I can find wisdom." Then Mrs. Bird began to cry and went away. When she had gone, Joan sat down and wrote this letter to catch the post. "Dear Sir, I have received your kind letter, and write to tell you that it is of no use your coming to London to see me tomorrow, as I was married this afternoon to Mr. Samuel Rock, and so good-bye, with all good wishes. Believe me, dear sir, ever yours, Joan." Joan was married on a Thursday, and upon the following morning Henry, who had slept but ill, rose early and went out before breakfast. As it chanced, the weather was mild, and the Rosham fields and woods looked soft and beautiful in the hazy November light. Henry walked to and fro about them, stopping here to admire the view, and there to speak a few kindly words to some labourer going to his daily toil, or to watch the pheasants drawing back to covert after filling their crops upon the stubble. Thus he lingered till long past the hour for breakfast, for he was sad at heart and loath to quit the lands that, as he thought, he would see no more, since he had determined not to revisit Rosham when once he had made Joan his wife. He felt that he was doing right in marrying her, but it was idle to deny that she was costing him dear. For 3 centuries his forefathers had owned these wide, familiar lands. There was no house upon them that they had not built. With the exception of a few ancient pollards, there was scarcely a tree that they had not planted. and now he must send them to the hammer because he had been unlucky enough to fall in love with the wrong woman. Well, such was his fortune, and he must make the best of it. Still, he may be pardoned if it wrung his heart to think that, in all human probability, he would never again see those fields and friendly faces, and that in his person the race of Graves were looking their last upon the soil that for hundreds of years had fed them while alive and covered them when dead. In a healthy man, however, even sentiment is not proof against hunger, so it came about that at last Henry limped home to breakfast with a heavy heart, and having ordered the dog that trotted at his heels back to its kennel, he entered the house by the side door and went to the dining-room. On his plate were several letters. He opened the first, which he noticed had an official frank in the left-hand corner. It was from his friend the Under-Secretary, informing him that, as it chanced, there was a billet open in Africa, and that he had obtained a promise from a colleague, in whose hands lay the patronage of the appointment, that if he proved suitable in some particulars, he, Henry, should have the offer of it. The letter added that, although the post was worth only $600 a year, it was in a good climate, and would certainly lead to better things, and that the writer would be glad if he would come to town to see about the matter as soon as might be convenient to him, since when it became known that the place was vacant, there were sure to be crowds of people after it who had claims upon the government. Here's a bit of good news at last, anyway, thought Henry, as he put down the letter. Whatever happens to us, Joan and I won't starve, and I dare say that we can be jolly enough out there. By Jove, if it wasn't for my mother and the thought that some of my father's debts must remain unpaid, I should almost be happy. And for a moment or two he gave himself over to a reverie in which the thought of Joan and of her tender love and beauty played the largest part, for he tried to forget the jarring tone of that second letter. Joan, whom after so long an absence he should see again that day. Then, remembering that the rest of his correspondence was unread, he took up an envelope and opened it without looking at the address. In 5 seconds it was on the floor beside him, and he was murmuring with pale lips, "I was married this afternoon to Samuel Rock. Impossible! It must be a hoax." Stooping down, he found the letter and examined it carefully. Either it was in Joan's writing or the forgery was perfect. Then he thought of the former letter, of which the tenor had disgusted him, and it occurred to him that it was an epistle which a woman contemplating some such treachery might very well have written. Had he then been deceived all along in this girl's character? It would seem so, and yet, she had sworn that she loved him, and that she hated the man Rock. What could have been her object in doing this thing? One only that he could see, money. Rock was a rich man, and he was a penniless baronet. If this letter were genuine, it became clear that she thought him good enough for a lover, but not for a husband, that she had amused herself with him, and now threw him over in favor of the solid advantages of a prosperous marriage with a man in her own class of life. Well, he had heard of women playing such tricks, and the hypothesis explained the attitude which Joan had all along adopted upon the question of becoming his wife. He remembered that from the first she disclaimed any wish to marry him. Oh, if this were so, what a blind fool he had been, and how unnecessarily had he tormented himself with doubts and searchings for the true path of duty. But as yet he could not believe that it was true. There must be some mistake. At least he would go to London and ascertain the facts before he passed judgment on the faith of such evidence. Why had he not gone before, in defiance of the doctor and Mrs. Bird? Half an hour later he was driving to the station. As he drew near to Bradmouth, he perceived a man walking along the road, in whom he recognized Samuel Rock. There's an end of that lie, he thought to himself with a sigh of relief, for if she married him yesterday afternoon, he would be in London with her, since he could scarcely have returned here to spend his honeymoon. At any rate, he would settle the question. Giving the reins to the coachman, he jumped down from the cart, and bidding him drive on a few yards, waited by the roadside. Presently Samuel caught sight of him, and stopped as though he meant to turn back. If so, he changed his mind almost instantly, and walked forward at a quick pace. "Good day, Mr. Rock," said Henry. "I wish to have a word with you. I have heard some strange news this morning, which you may be able to explain." "What news?" asked Samuel, looking at him insolently. "That you were married to Joan Haste yesterday." "Well, what about that, Sir Henry Graves?" "Nothing in particular, Mr. Rock, except that I do not believe it." "Don't you?" answered Samuel with a sneer. "Then perhaps you'll throw your eye over this." And he produced from his pocket a copy of the marriage certificate. Henry read it and turned very white. Then he handed it back without a word. "It is all in order, I think," said Samuel, still sneering. "Apparently," Henry answered. "May I ask if Mrs. Rock is with you?" "No, she isn't. Do you think that I am fool enough to bring her here at present, for you to be sneaking about after her? I know what your game is, 'cause she told me all about it. You were going up to town today to get hold of her, weren't you? Well, you're an hour behind the fair this time. Joan may have been a bit flighty, but she's a sensible woman at bottom, and she knew better than to trust herself to a scamp without a sixpence like you, when she might have an honest man and a good home. I told you I meant to marry her, and you see I have kept my word. And now look you here, Sir Henry Graves. Just you keep clear of her in future, for if I catch you so much as speaking to her, it will be the worse both for yourself and Joan. Not that she cares a rotten herring about you, although she did fool you so prettily. You need not fear that I shall attempt to disturb your domestic happiness, Mr. Rock. And now, for heaven's sake, get out of my way before I forget myself." Samuel obeyed, still grinning and sneering with hate and jealousy, and Henry walked on to where the dog-cart was waiting for him. Taking the reins, he turned the horse's head and drove back to Rosham. "Thompson," he said to the butler, who came to open the door, "I have changed my mind about going to town today. You can unpack my things. Stop a minute, though. I remember I am due at Monk's Lodge, so you needn't meddle with the big portmanteau. When does my mother come back?" "Tomorrow. Her ladyship wrote me this morning, Sir Henry." "Oh, very well. Then I shan't see her till Tuesday, but it doesn't matter. Send down to the keeper and tell him that I want to speak to him, will you? I think that I will change my clothes and shoot some rabbits after lunch. Stop, order the dog-cart to be ready to drive me to Monk's Lodge in time to dress for dinner." To analyze Henry's feelings during the remainder of that day would be difficult, if not impossible, but those of shame and bitter anger were uppermost in his mind. Shame that he had laid himself open to such words as Rock used to him, and anger that his vanity and blind faith in a woman's soft speeches and feigned love should have led him into so ignominious a position. Mingled with these emotions were his natural pangs of jealousy and disappointed affection, though pride would not suffer him to give way to them. Again and again he reviewed every detail of the strange and to his sense appalling story, and at times, overpowering as was the evidence, his mind refused to accept its obvious moral, namely, that he had been tricked and made a tool of, yes, used as a foil to bring this man to the point of marriage. How was it possible to reconcile Joan's conduct in the past, and that wild letter of hers with her subsequent letters and action? Thus only, that as regards the first she had been playing on his feelings and inexperience of the arts of women, and that, as in sleep, men who are no poets can sometimes compose verse which is full of beauty, so in her delirium Joan had been able to set on paper words and thoughts that were foreign to her nature and above its level. Or perhaps that letter was a forgery written by Mrs. Bird, who was so romantic. The circumstances under which it reached him were peculiar, and Joan herself expressly repudiated all knowledge of it. Notwithstanding his doubts, perplexities, and suffering, as might have been expected, the matter in the end resolved itself into two very simple issues. First, that whatever may have been her exact reasons, Joan Haste had broken with him once and for all by marrying another man. And second, that, as a corollary to her act, many dangers and difficulties which beset him had disappeared, and he was free, if he wished it, to marry another woman. Henry was no fool, and when the first bitterness was past, and he could consider the matter, if not without passion as yet, at least more calmly, he saw, the girl being what she had proved herself to be, that all things were working together for his good and the advantage of his family. Supposing, for instance, that he had found her out after marriage instead of before it, and supposing that the story which she told him in her first letter had been true, instead of what it clearly was, a lie. Surely in these and in many other ways his escape had been what an impartial person might call fortunate. At the least of her own act she had put an end to an imbroglio that had many painful aspects, and there remained no stain upon his honor for which he was most truly thankful. And now, having learnt his lesson in the hard school of experience, he would write to his friend, the under-secretary, saying he could not be in town till Wednesday. Meanwhile, he would pay his visit at Monk's Lodge. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. Disenchantment. It was Sunday evening at Monk's Lodge, and Henry and Mr. Levenger were sitting over their wine after dinner. For a while they talked upon indifferent subjects, and more particularly about the shooting on the previous day and the arrangements for the morrow's sport. Then there was a silence, which Mr. Levenger broke. "I have heard a curious bit of news," he said, "about Joan Haste. It seems that she is married." Henry drank half a glass of port wine and answered, "Yes, I know. She has married your tenant Samuel Rock, the dissenter, a very strange person. I cannot understand it." "Can't you? I think I can. It is a good match for her, though I don't altogether approve of it, and know nothing of the details. However, I wasn't consulted, and there it is. I hope that they may be happy." "So do I," said Henry grimly. "And now, Mr. Levenger, I want to have a word with you about the estate affairs. What is to be done? It is time that you took some steps to protect yourself." "It seems to me, Graves," he answered deliberately, "that my course of action must very much depend upon your own. You know what I mean." "Yes, Mr. Levenger, but are you still anxious that I should propose to your daughter? Forgive me if I speak plainly." "That has always been my wish, and I see no particular reason to change it. But do you think that it is her wish, Mr. Levenger? I fancy that her manner has been a little cold to me of late, perhaps with justice, and," he added rather nervously, "naturally I do not wish to lay myself open to a rebuff. I find that I am very ignorant of the ways of women, as of various other things." "Many of us have made that discovery, Graves, and of course it is impossible for me to guarantee your success, though I think that you will be successful. There is another matter, Mr. Levenger. Emma has considerable possessions. Am I then justified in my impoverished condition in asking her to take me? Would she not think that I did so from obvious motives? On that point you may make your mind quite easy, Graves, for I, who am the girl's father, tell you that I consider you will be giving her quite as much as she gives you. I have never hidden from you that I am in a sense a man under a cloud. My follies came to an end many years ago, it is true, and I have never fallen into the clutches of the law. Still, they were bad enough to force me to change my name and to begin life afresh. Should you marry my daughter, and should you wish it, you will, of course, have the right to learn my true name, though on that point I shall make an appeal to your generosity and ask you not to press your right. I have done with the past, of which even the thought is hateful to me, and I do not wish to reopen old sores. So perhaps you may be content with the assurance that I am of a good and ancient family, and that before I got into trouble I served in the army with some distinction. For instance, I received the wound that crippled me at the Battle of the Alma. I shall never press you to tell that which you desire to keep to yourself, Mr. Levenger." "It is like you to say so, Graves," he answered with evident relief. "But the mere fact that I make such a request will show you what I mean when I say that Emma has as much or more to gain from this marriage than you have, since it is clear that some rumors of her father's disgrace must follow her through life. Moreover, she is humbly born upon her mother's side. I do trust and pray, my dear fellow, that it will come off. Alas, I am not long for this world. My heart is troubling me more and more, and the doctors have warned me that I may die at any moment. Therefore, it is my most earnest desire to see the daughter whom I love better than anything on earth happily settled before I go." "Well, Mr. Levenger," Henry answered, "I will ask her tomorrow if I find an opportunity, but the issue does not rest with me. I only wish that I were more worthy of her." "I am glad to hear it. God bless you, and God speed you, my dear Graves. I hope when I am gone that whatever you may learn about my unfortunate past, you will still try to think kindly of me, and to remember that I was a man, cursed by nature with passions of unusual strength, which neither my education nor the circumstances of my early life helped me to control." "It is not for me to judge you or any other man. I leave that to those who are without sin," said Henry, and the conversation came to an end. That night Henry was awakened by hearing people moving backwards and forwards in the passages. For a moment he thought of burglars, and wondered if he should get up, but the sounds soon ceased, so he turned over and went to sleep again. As he learned in the morning, the cause of the disturbance was that Mr. Levenger had been seized with one of his heart attacks, which for a few minutes threatened to be serious, if not fatal. Under the influence of restoratives that were always kept at hand, the danger passed as quickly as it had arisen, although Emma remained by her father's bedside to watch him for a while. "That was a near thing, Emma," he said presently. "For about 30 seconds I almost thought—" and he stopped. "Well, it is over now, father dear," she answered. "Yes, but for how long? One day I shall be taken in this fashion and come back no more." "Pray don't talk like that, father." "Why not, seeing that it is what I must accustom my mind to? Oh, Emma, if I could but see you safely married, I should not trouble so much. But the uncertainty as to your future worries me more than anything else. However, you must settle these things for yourself. I have no right to dictate to you about them. Good night, my love, and thank you for your kindness. No, there is no need for you to stop up. If I should want anything, I will touch the bell." "I wonder why he is so bent upon my getting married," thought Emma, as she went back to her bed, "especially as, even did anything happen to him, I shall be left well off at least. I suppose so. Well, it is no use my troubling myself about it till the time comes, if it ever does come." After his attack of the previous night, Mr. Levenger was unable to come out shooting as he had hoped to do. He said, however, that if he felt well enough he would drive in the afternoon to a spot known as the Hanging Wood, which was to be the last and best beat of the day, and it was arranged that Emma should accompany him and walk home, a distance of some 2 miles. The day was fine and the shooting very fair, but, fond as he was of the sport, Henry did not greatly enjoy himself, which, in view of what lay behind and before him, is scarcely to be wondered at. After luncheon the guns and beaters were employed in driving 2 narrow covers, each of them about half a mile long, towards a wood planted upon the top of a rise of ground. On they went steadily, firing at cock pheasants only, till, the end of the plantations being unstopped, the greater number of the birds were driven into this hanging wood, which ended in a point situated about 120 yards from the borders of the 2 converging plantations. Between these plantations and the wood lay a little valley of pasture land, through which ran a stream, and it was the dip of this valley, together with the position of the cover on the opposite slope, that gave to the hanging wood its reputation of being the most sporting spot for pheasant shooting in that neighborhood. The slaughter of hand-reared pheasants is frequently denounced, for the most part by people who know little about it, as a tame and cruel amusement. And it cannot be denied that this is sometimes so, especially where the object of the keeper, or of his master, is not to show sport, but to return a heavy total of slain at the end of the day. In the case of a cover such as has been described, matters are very different, however, for then the pheasants, flying towards their homes, from which they have been disturbed, come over the guns with great speed and at a height of from 28 to 40 yards, and the shooting must be good that will bring to bag more than 1 in 4 of them. By the banks of the stream, between the covers, Henry and his companions found Mr. Levenger and Emma waiting for them, the pony trap in which they had come, having been driven off to a little distance so as not to interfere with the beat. "Here I am," said Mr. Levenger. "I don't feel up to much, but I was determined to see the hanging wood shot again, even if it should be for the last time. Now then, Bowles, get your beaters round as quick as you can, and be careful that they keep wide of the cover, and don't make a noise. I will place the guns. You've no time to lose. The light is beginning to fade." Bowles and his small army moved off to the right, while Mr. Levenger pointed out to each sportsman the spot to which he should go upon the banks of the stream, assigning to Henry the center stand, both because he was accompanied by a loader with a second gun, and on account of his reputation of being the best shot present. "The wind is rising fast and blowing straight down the cover," said Mr. Levenger, when he had completed his arrangements. "Those wild-bred birds will take some stopping, unless I am much mistaken. I tell you what, Graves, I bet you half a crown that you don't kill a pheasant for every 4 cartridges you fire, taking them as they come, without shirking the hard ones." "All right," answered Henry, "I can run to that." And they both laughed, while Emma, who was standing by, dressed in a pretty gray tweed costume, looked pleased to see her father show so much interest in anything. 10 minutes passed, and a shrill whistle, blown far away at the end of the cover, announced that the beaters were about to start. Henry cocked his gun and waited, till presently a brace of pheasants were seen coming towards him, with the wind in their tails, and at a tremendous height, one bird being some 50 yards in front of the other. "Over you, Graves," said Mr. Levenger. Henry waited till the first bird was at the proper angle, and fired both barrels, aiming at least 3 yards ahead of him, but without producing the slightest effect upon the old cock, which sailed away serenely. Snatching his second gun with an exclamation, he repeated the performance at the hen that followed, and with a similar lack of result. "There go 4 cartridges anyway," said Mr. Levenger. "It isn't fair to count them," answered Henry, laughing. "Those birds were clean out of shot." "Yes, out of your shot, Graves. You were yards behind them. You mustn't be content with aiming ahead here, especially in this wind. If you don't swing as well, you'll scarcely kill a bird. Look out, here comes another. There, you've missed him again. Swing, man, swing." By this time Henry was fairly nettled, for, chancing to look around, he saw that Emma was laughing at his discomfiture. The next time a bird came over him, he took his host's advice and swung with a vengeance, and down it fell far behind him, dead as a stone. "That's better, Graves. You caught him in the head." Now the fun became fast and furious, and Emma, watching Henry's face as he fired away, with as much earnestness and energy as though the fate of the British Empire depended upon each shot, thought that he was quite handsome. Handsome he was not, nor ever would be, but it is true that, like most Englishmen, he looked his best in his rough shooting clothes, and when intent upon his sport. 5 minutes more, and the firing, which had been continuous all along the line, began to slacken and then died away altogether, Henry distinguishing himself by killing the last 2 birds that flew over with a brilliant right and left. Still, when the slain came to be counted, it was found that he had lost his bet by 1 cartridge. "Don't be depressed," said Levenger, as he pocketed the half-crown. "The other fellows have done much worse. I don't believe that young Jones has touched a feather. The fact is that a great many of the birds you fired at were quite impossible. I never remember seeing them fly so high and fast before. But then this wood has not been shot in half a gale of wind for many years. And now I must say good-bye to those gentlemen and be off, or I shall get a chill. You'll see my daughter home, won't you?" As it chanced, Emma had gone to fetch a pheasant, which she said had fallen in the edge of the plantation behind them. When she returned with the bird, it was impossible for her to accompany her father, even if she wished to do so, for he had already driven away. Henry congratulated her upon the skill with which she had marked down the cock, at the same time announcing his intention of reclaiming the half-crown from her father. Then, having given his guns to the loader, they started for the high road, accompanied by the 2 pupils of the neighboring clergyman. A few hundred yards farther on, these young gentlemen went upon their way rejoicing, bearing with them a leash of pheasants and a hare. "You must show me the road home, Miss Levenger," said Henry, by way of making conversation, for they were now alone. "The shortest path is along the cliff, if you think that we can get over the fence," she answered. The hedge did not prove unclimbable, and presently they were walking along the edge of the cliff. Below them foamed an angry sea, for the tide was high, driven shoreward by the weight of the easterly gale, while to the west the sky was red with the last rays of a wintry sunset. For a while they walked in silence, which Emma broke, saying, "The sea is very beautiful tonight, is it not?" "It is always beautiful to me," he answered. "I see that you have not got over leaving the Navy yet, Sir Henry." "Well, Miss Levenger, to tell you the truth, I haven't had a very pleasant time since I came ashore. One way and another there have been nothing but sorrow and worries and disagreeables, till often and often I have wished myself off the coast of Newfoundland, with ice about and a cotton-wool fog, or anywhere else that is dangerous and unpleasant." "I know that you have had plenty of trouble, Sir Henry," she said in her gentle voice, "and your father's death must have been a great blow to you, but perhaps your fog will lift, as I suppose that it does sometimes, even on the coast of Newfoundland." "I hope so. It is time that it did," he answered absently, and then for a minute was silent. He felt that, if he meant to propose, now was his chance, but for the life of him he could not think how to begin. It was an agonizing moment, and, though the evening had turned bitterly cold, he became aware that the perspiration was running down his forehead. "Miss Levenger," he said suddenly, "I have something to ask you." "To ask me, Sir Henry? What about?" About yourself. I wish to ask you if you will honor me by promising to become my wife." Emma heard, and stopping suddenly in her walk, looked round as though to find a refuge, but seeing none, went on again. "Miss Levenger," Henry continued, "I am not skilled at this sort of thing, and I hope that you will make allowances for my awkwardness. Do you think that you could care enough for me to marry me? I know very well that I have little to recommend me, and there are circumstances connected with my financial position which make it almost presumptuous that I should ask you." "I think, Sir Henry," she answered, speaking for the first time, "that we may leave money matters out of the question. I have heard something of the state of affairs at Rosham, and I know that you are not responsible for it, though you are expected by others to remedy it." "It is very generous of you to speak like that, Miss Levenger, and it helps me out of a great difficulty, for I could not see how I was to explain all this business to you." "I think that it is only just, Sir Henry, not generous. Provided that there is enough on one side or the other, money is not the principal question to be considered." "No, Miss Levenger, I agree with you, though I have known others who thought differently. The main thing is whether you can care enough about me." "That is one thing, Sir Henry," she answered in a low voice. "Also there are others." "I suppose that you mean whether or no I am worthy of you, Miss Levenger. Well, even though it should destroy my chances with you, I will tell you frankly that in my judgment I am not. Listen, Miss Levenger, till within a few months ago I had never cared about any woman. Then I saw you for the second time, and thought you the sweetest lady that I had ever met, for I understood how good and true you are, and in my heart I hoped that a day would come when I might venture to ask you what I am asking you now. Afterwards trouble arose, through my own weakness and folly, trouble between myself and another woman. I am sure that you will not press me for details, because in order to give them I must betray another person's secret. To be brief, I should probably have married this woman, but she threw me over and chose another man." "What?" said Emma, startled out of her self-control. "Is Joan Haste married?" "I see that you know more about me than I thought. She is married, to Mr. Samuel Rock." "I cannot understand it at all. It is almost incredible." "Nor can I, but the fact remains. She wrote to tell me of it herself, and what is more, her husband showed me the marriage certificate. And now I have made a clean breast of it, for I will not sail under false colors, and you must judge me. If you choose to take me, I promise you that no woman shall ever have a better husband than I will be to you, for your happiness and welfare shall be the first objects of my life. The question is, after what I have told you, can you care for me?" Emma stopped, for all this while they had been walking slowly, and looked him full in the eyes, a last red ray of the dying light falling on her sweet face. "Sir Henry," she said, "you have been frank with me, and I honor you for it. None the less, because I happen to know something of the story, and now I will be equally frank with you, though to do so is humbling to me. When I stayed in the same house with you more than 2 years ago, you took little notice of me, but I grew fond of you, and I have never changed my mind. Still, I do not think that, as things are, I should marry you on this account alone, seeing that a woman looks for love in her marriage. And, Sir Henry, in all that you have said to me, you have spoken no— How could I, knowing what I had to tell you? He broke in. I cannot say, but it is so, and therefore, speaking for myself alone, I should be inclined to answer you that we had best go our separate ways in life, though I am sure that, as you promise, you would be a good and kind husband to me. But there are other people to be considered. There is my father, who is most anxious that I should make a satisfactory marriage, such as I know this would be for me, for I am nobody, and scarcely recognized in society here, and who has the greatest respect and affection for you, as he had for your father before you. Then there is your family. If I refuse you, it would mean that you would all be ruined, and though it may hurt your pride to hear me say so, I shrink from such a thought. Oh, pray do not let that weigh with you, he interrupted. You know well that, although much of what you say is unhappily true, I am not seeking you that you may amend my broken fortunes, but because you are what you are, I desire above all things to make you my wife. I am sorry, Sir Henry, but though I believe every word you say, I must let it weigh with me, for I wish to be a blessing to those about me, and not a curse. Well, for all these reasons, and chiefly perhaps, to be honest, because I am fond of you, though you do not care very much for me, I will be your wife, Sir Henry, as you are good enough to wish it. And she gave him her hand. He took it and kissed it, and they walked on in silence till they were near to the house. Then Henry spoke, and his voice betrayed more emotion than he cared to show. How can I thank you, Emma? He said. What am I to say to you? It is useless for me to make protestations which you would not believe, though perhaps they might have more truth in them than you imagine. But I am sure of this, that if we live, a time will soon come when you will not doubt me if I tell you that I love you. And, drawing her to him, he kissed her upon the forehead. I hope so, Henry, she said, disengaging herself from his arms, and they went together into the house. Within 10 weeks of this date, Henry and Emma were spending a long honeymoon among the ruined temples of the Nile. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. The Desire of Death and the Fear of Him. Joan remained at Kent Street, and the weary days crept on. When the first excitement of her self-sacrifice had faded from her mind, she lapsed into a condition of melancholy that was pitiable to see. Every week brought her rambling and impassioned epistles from her husband, most of which she threw into the fire, half read. At length there came one that she perused eagerly enough, for it announced the approaching marriage of Sir Henry Graves and Miss Levenger, tidings which were confirmed in a few brief words by a note from Mr. Levenger himself, enclosing her monthly allowance, for from Samuel as yet she would take nothing. Then in January another letter reached her, together with a copy of the local paper, describing the ceremony, the presents, the dress, and the appearance of the lovely bride and the gallant bridegroom, Captain Sir Henry Graves, Bart, R.N. At least I have not done all this for nothing, said Joan, as she threw down the paper, and then for the rest of that day she lay upon her bed, moaning with the pain of her bitter jealousy and immeasurable despair. She felt now that, had she known what she must suffer, she would never have found the strength to act as she had done, and time upon time did she regret that she had allowed her impulses to carry her away. Rock had been careful to inform her of his interview with Henry, putting his own gloss upon what passed between them, and the knowledge that her lover must hate and despise her was the sharpest arrow of the many which were fixed in her poor heart. All the rest she could bear, but than this death himself had been more kind. How pitiable was her state! Scorned by Henry, of whose child she must be the mother, but who was now the loving husband of another woman, and given over to a man she hated, and who would shortly claim his bond. Alas, no regrets, however poignant, could serve to undo the past, any more than the fear of it could avert the future. For Mrs. Bird was right. As she had sown, so she must reap. One by one the weary days crept on, till at length the long London winter gave way to spring, and the time of her trial drew near. In health she remained fairly well, since sorrow worked slowly upon so vigorous a constitution. But the end of each week found her sadder and more broken in spirit than its beginning. She had no friends, and went out but little, Indeed, her only relaxations were found in reading, with the vague idea of improving her mind, because Henry had once told her to do so, or conversing in the deaf and dumb language with Jim and Sally. Still, her life was not an idle one, for as time went by, the shadow of a great catastrophe fell upon the Kent Street household. Mrs. Bird's eyesight began to fail her, and the hospital doctors whom she consulted were of the opinion that the weakness must increase. "Oh, my dear," she said to Joan, "what is to happen to all of us if I go blind? I have a little money put away, about £150, or 200 in all, perhaps, but it will soon melt, and then I suppose that they will take us to the workhouse. And you know, my dear, they separate husband and wife in those places." And, quite broken down by such a prospect, the poor little woman began to weep. "At any rate, there is no need for you to trouble yourself about it at present," answered Joan gently, "since Sally helps, and I can do the fine work that you cannot manage." "It is very kind of you, Joan. Ah, little did I know, when I took you in out of the street that day, what a blessing you would prove to me, and how I should learn to love you. Also, it is wicked of me to repine, for God has always looked after us heretofore, and I do not believe that he who feeds the ravens will suffer us to starve or to be separated. So I will try to be brave and trust in him." "Ah," answered Joan, "I wish I could have your faith. But I suppose it is only given to good people. Now, where is the work? Let me begin at once. No, don't thank me any more. It will be a comfort. Besides, I would stitch my fingers off for you." Thenceforth, Mrs. Bird's orders were fulfilled as regularly as ever they had been, and as Joan anticipated, the constant employment gave her some relief. But while she sat and sewed for hour after hour, a new desire entered into her mind, that most terrible of all desires, the desire of death. Of death she became enamored, and her daily prayer to heaven was that she might die, she and her child together, since her imagination could picture no future in another world more dreadful than that which awaited her in this. Only once during these months did she hear anything of Henry, and then it was through the columns of a penny paper, where, under the heading of Society Jottings, she read that Sir Henry Graves, Bart., R.N., and his beautiful bride were staying at Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, where the gallant captain was very popular, and Lady Graves was much admired. The paragraph added that they were going to travel in the Holy Land, and expected to return to their seat at Rosham towards the end of May. It was shortly after she read this that Joan, who from constantly thinking about death had convinced herself that she would die, went through the formality of making a will on a sixpenny form which she bought for that purpose. To Sir Henry Graves she left the books that he had given her, and a long letter which she was at much trouble to compose, and placed carefully in the same envelope with the will. All the rest of her property, of any sort whatsoever, whereof she might die, possessed it amounted to about £30, and some clothes she devised to Mrs. Bird for the use of her unborn child, should it live, and, failing that, to Mrs. Bird absolutely. At last the inevitable hour of her trouble came upon her, and left her pale and weak, but holding a little daughter in her arms. From the first the child was sickly, for the long illness of the mother had affected its constitution, and within 3 weeks from the day of its birth it was laid to rest in a London cemetery, leaving Joan to drink the cup of a new and a deeper agony than any that it had been her lot to taste. Yet, when her first days of grief and prostration had gone by, almost could she find it in her heart to rejoice that the child had been taken from her, and placed beyond the possibilities of such a life as she had led. For, otherwise, how would things have gone with it when she, its mother, passed into the power of Samuel Rock? Surely he would have hated and maltreated it, and, if fate had left it without the protection of her love in the hands of such a guardian, its existence might have been made a misery. Still, after the death of that infant, those about her never saw a smile upon Joan's face, however closely they might watch for it. Perhaps she was more beautiful now than she had ever been, for the chestnut hair that clustered in short curls upon her shapely head, and her great sorrowful eyes, shining in the pallor of her sweet face, refined and made strange her loveliness. Moreover, if the grace of girlhood had left her, it was replaced by another and truer dignity, the dignity of a woman who has loved and suffered and lost. One morning, it was on the 9th of June, Joan received a letter from her husband, who now wrote to her every 2 or 3 days. Before she opened it, she knew well from past experience what would be the tenor of its contents, and appealed to her, more or less impassioned, to shorten the year of separation for which she had stipulated, and come to live with him as his wife. She was not mistaken, for the letter ended thus: "Oh, Joan, have pity on me and come to me, for if you don't, I think that I shall go crazed. I have kept my promise to you faithful so far, so if you are made of flesh and blood, show mercy before you drive me to something desperate. It's all over now. The child's dead, you tell me, and the man's married, so let's turn a new leaf and begin afresh. After all, Joan, you are my wife before God and man, and it is to me that your duty lies, not to anybody else. Even if you haven't any fondness for me, I ask you in the name of that duty to listen to me, and I tell you that if you don't, I believe that I shall go mad with the longing to see your face, and the sin of it will be upon you. I've done up the house comfortable for you, Joan. No money has been spared, and if you want anything more, you shall have it. Then don't go on hiding yourself away from me, but come and take the home that waits you. I suppose he is right, and that it is my duty, said Joan to herself with a sigh as she laid down the letter. Love and hope and happiness have gone from me. Nothing is left except duty, so I had better hold fast to it. I will write and say that I will go soon within a few days, though what the birds will do without me I do not know, unless he will let me give them some of my allowance. Having come to this determination, Joan wrote her letter and posted it, fearing lest, should she delay, her virtuous resolution might fail her. As she returned from the pillar box, a messenger, who was standing on the steps of number 8, handed her a telegram addressed to herself. Wondering what it might be, she opened it to read this message. Come down here at once. I am ill and must see you before it is too late. The carriage will meet the 5 o'clock train at Monk's Vale Station. Wire reply. Levenger, Monk's Lodge. I wonder what he can want to see me for, thought Joan. Then, asking the boy to wait in the passage, she went in to consult Mrs. Bird. You had best go, my dear, she said. I have always thought that there was some mystery about this Mr. Levenger, and now I expect that it is coming out. If you take a cab at once, you will just have time to catch the 12 o'clock train at Liverpool Street. Joan nodded, and writing one word upon the prepaid answer, coming, gave it to the boy and ran upstairs to pack a few things in a bag. In 10 minutes a hansom was at the door, and she was ready to start. First she bade good-bye to the 2 invalids, who were much disturbed at this hurried departure, and then to Mrs. Bird, who followed her into the passage, kissing her again and again. Do you know, Joan, she said, beginning to cry, I feel as if you were going away for good, and I should never see you any more. Nonsense, dear, she answered briefly, for a queer contraction in her throat made a lengthened speech impossible. I hope to be back in a day or 2 if all is well. Yes, Joan, if all is well, and there's hope for everybody. Well, good-bye, and God bless you wherever you go. God bless you here and hereafter, forever and ever. Then Joan drove away, and as she went it came into her mind that it would be best if she returned no more. She had promised to join her husband in a few days. Why should she not do so at once, and thus avoid the pain of a formal parting with the Birds, her true and indeed her only friends? By 4:30 that afternoon, the train pulled up at Bradmouth, where she must change into the light railway, with tram-car carriages that runs for 15 or 20 miles along the coast, Monk's Vale being the second station from the junction. The branch train did not start for 10 minutes, and Joan employed the interval in walking up and down the platform, looking at the church tower, the roofs of the fishing village, the boats upon the beach, and the familiar view of land and sea. Everything seemed quite unchanged. She alone was changed, and felt as though a century of time had passed over her head since that morning when she ran away to London. "Hello, Joan Rock," said a half-remembered voice at her elbow. "I'm in luck, it seems. I saw you off, and here I am to welcome you back. But you shouldn't have married him, Joan. You should have waited for me as I told you. I'm in business for myself now. 4 saddle donkeys and a goat chase, and doing grand. I shall die a rich man, you bet." Joan turned round to see a youth with impudent blue eyes and hair of flaming red, in whom she recognized Willie Hood, much elongated, but otherwise the same. "Oh, Willie, is that you?" she said, stretching out her hand, for she was pleased to see a friendly face. "How are you, and how do you know that I am married?" "No? Why, if you sent the crier round with a bell to call it, folks would hear, wouldn't they? And that's just about what Mr. Samuel Rock has done, talking of my wife, Joan Haste, as was here, there, and everywhere, and telling how as you were stopping in foreign parts a while for the benefit of your health, which seems a strange tale to me, and I know a thing or 2 I do. Not that it has done you much good, anyway, to judge from the air of you, for you look like the ghost of what you used to be. I'll tell you what, Joan, for the sake of old times, you shall have a ride every morning on my best donkey, all for love, if Sammy won't be jealous. That'll bring the color back into your cheeks, you bet." "How are my uncle and aunt?" asked Joan, hastening to change the conversation. "How are they? Will you promise to bear up if I tell you? Well, then, Mrs. G is lodging for 3 months at the public expense in Ipswich jail. which the beaks gave her for assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm. Them was the words, for I went to hear the case, upon the person of her lawful husband, John Gillingwater. And my, she did hammer him too, with a rolling pin. His face was like a squashed pumpkin, with no eyes left for a sinner to swear by. The guardians have taken pity on him too, and are nursing him well again, all for nothing, in the Union. I saw him hoeing taters there the other day, and he asked me if I couldn't smuggle him a bottle of gin. Yes, and nearly cried when I told him that it wasn't to be done unless I had the cash in hand and a commission. At this moment Willie's flow of information was interrupted by the guard, who told Joan that she must get into the train if she did not wish to be left. "Ta-ta, Mrs. Rock," cried Willie after her. "See you again soon, and remember that the donkey is always ready. Now," he added to himself, "I wonder why the dickens she is going that way instead of home to her loving Sammy. He's a nasty, mean beast, he is, and it's a rum go, her having married him at all, but it ain't no affair of mine. All the same, I mean to let my dickies run down by the mears tonight, for I'm sure he can't grudge an armful of rough grass to an old friend of his wife's, as has been the first to welcome her home. By the way, why ain't the holy Samuel here to welcome her home himself?" And Master Willie scratched his red head and departed speculating, with the full intention of pasturing his donkeys that night upon lands in the possession or hire of the said Samuel. At Monksville Station, Joan found a dog cart waiting for her. When she had taken her seat, she asked the groom if Mr. Levenger was ill. He replied that he didn't rightly know, but that his master had kept the house almost ever since Miss Emma, he meant Lady Graves, had married, and that last night, feeling queer, he had sent for a doctor. Then Joan asked if Lady Graves was at Monk's Lodge, and was informed that she and her husband were not expected home at Rosham from abroad till this night or the next morning. By this time they had reached the house, which was not more than half a mile distant from the station. The servant who opened the door took Joan to a bedroom and said that tea was waiting for her. When she was ready, she went downstairs to the dining room, where presently she received a message that Mr. Levenger would be glad to see her, and was shown to his room on the first floor. She found him seated in an armchair by a fire, although the weather was warm for June, and noticed at once that he was much changed since she had last seen him, his face being pale and thin, and his form shrunken. His eyes, however, retained their brightness and intelligence, and his manner its vivacity. As she entered the room, he attempted to rise to receive her, only to sink back into his chair with a groan, where for a while he remained speechless. "It's very good of you to come to see me, Joan," he said presently. "Pray be seated." "I am sorry to hear that you have not been well, sir," she answered. "No, Joan, I have not. There never was a man further from health or much nearer to death than I am at this moment, and that is why I have sent for you, since what I have to say cannot be put off any longer. But you do not look very well yourself, Joan." "I feel quite strong, thank you, sir. You know I had a bad illness, for you very kindly came to see me, and it has taken me a while to recover." "I hear that you are married, Joan, although you are not living with your husband, Samuel Rock. It would perhaps have been well if you had consulted me before taking such a step, but you have a right to manage your own affairs. I trust that you are happy, though, if so, I do not understand why you keep away," and he looked at her anxiously. "I am as happy as I ever shall be, sir, and I go to live with Mr. Rock tomorrow. Till now I have been detained in town by business. You know that my daughter is married to Sir Henry Graves," he went on after a pause, again searching her face with his eyes. "They return home tonight or tomorrow, and not too soon if they wish to see me alive, though they know nothing of that, for I have told them little of my state of health." "Yes, sir," she answered imperturbably, though her hands shook as she spoke. "But I suppose that you did not send for me to tell me that, sir?" "No, Joan, no. Is the door shut? I sent for you. Oh, my God, that I should have to say it. To throw myself upon your mercy, since I dare not die and face the judgment seat till I have told you all the truth. Listen to me," and his voice fell to a piercing whisper. "Joan, you are my daughter." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Allison. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. The truth, the whole truth. "Your daughter!" she said, rising in her astonishment. "You must be mad. If I were your daughter, could you have lied to me as you did, and treated me as you have done? I pray you to listen before you judge, and at present spare your reproaches, for believe me, Joan, I am not fit to bear them. Remember that I need have told you nothing of this. The secret might have been buried in my grave. "As it would have been, sir, had you not feared to die with such falsehood on your soul." He made an imploring gesture with his hand, and she ceased. "Joan," he went on, "I will tell you the whole truth. You are not only my child, you are also legitimate." "And Miss Levenger, Lady Graves, I mean, is she legitimate too?" "No, Joan." She heard and bit her lip till the blood ran, but even so she could not keep silence. "Oh," she cried, "I wonder if you will ever understand what you have done in hiding this from me. Do you know that you have ruined my life?" "I pray that you may be mistaken, Joan. Heaven is my witness that I have tried to act for the best. Listen. Many years ago, when I was still a youngish man, it was my fate to meet and to fall in love with your mother, Jane Lakin. Like you, she was beautiful, but unlike you, she was hot-tempered, violently jealous, and, when she was angered, rough of speech. Such as she was, however, she obtained a complete empire over my mind, for I was headstrong and passionate. Indeed, so entirely did I fall into her power, that in the end I consented to marry her. This, however, I did not dare to do here, for in those days I was poor and struggling, and it would have ruined me. Separately, and without a word being said to anyone, we went to London, and there were secretly married in an obscure parish in the East End. In proof of my words, here is a copy of the certificate." And, taking a paper from a dispatch box that stood on the table beside him, he handed it to Joan, then went on. "As you may guess, a marriage thus entered into between two people so dissimilar in tastes, habits, and education did not prove successful. For a month or so we were happy, then quarrels began. I established her in lodgings in London, and, while ostensibly carrying on my business as a land agent here, visited her from time to time. With this, however, she was not satisfied, for she desired to be acknowledged openly as my wife, and to return with me to Bradmouth. I refused to comply. Indeed, I dared not do so, whereupon she reviled me with ever-increasing bitterness. Moreover, she became furiously jealous, and extravagant beyond the limit of my means. At length matters reached a climax, for a chance sight that she caught of me driving in a carriage with another woman provoked so dreadful an outburst that in my rage and despair I told her a falsehood. I told her, Joan, that she was not really my wife, and had no claim upon me, seeing that I had married her under a false name. This in itself was true, for my own name is not Levenger, but it is not true that the marriage was thereby invalidated, since neither she nor those among whom I had lived for several years knew me by any other. When your mother heard this, she replied only that such conduct was just what she would have expected from me, and that night I returned to Bradmouth, having first given her a considerable sum of money, for I did not think that I should see her again for some time. 2 days afterwards I received a letter from her. Here it is, and he read it. "George, though I may be what you call me, a common woman and a jealous scold, at least I have too much pride to go on living with the scoundrel who has deceived me by a sham marriage. If I were as bad as you think, I might have the law of you, but I won't do that, especially as I dare say that we shall be best apart. Now I am going straight away, where you will never find me, so you need not trouble to look, even if you care to. I haven't told you yet that I expect to have a child. If it comes to anything, I will let you know about it. If not, you may be sure that it is dead, or that I am. Goodbye, George. For a week or two we were happy, and though you hate me, I still love you in my own way. But I will never live with you again, so don't trouble your head any more about me. Yours, Jane Blank. P.S. Not knowing what my name is, I can't sign it." When I received this letter, I went to London and tried to trace your mother, but could hear nothing of her. Some 8 or 9 months passed by, and one day a letter came addressed to me, written by a woman in New York. I have it here if you wish to see it. Enclosing what purports to be a properly attested American certificate of the death of Jane Lakin of Bradmouth in England. The letter says that Jane Lakin, who passed herself off as a widow and was employed as a housekeeper in an hotel in New York, died in childbirth with her infant in the house of the writer, who, by her request, forwarded the certificate of death, together with her marriage ring and her love. I grieved for your mother, Joan, but I made no further inquiries, as I should have done, for I did not doubt the story, and in those days it was not easy to follow up such a matter on the other side of the Atlantic. A year went by, and I married again, my second wife being Emma Johnson, the daughter of old Johnson, who owned a fleet of fishing boats and a great deal of other property, and lived at the Red House in Bradmouth. Some months after our marriage he died, and we came to live at Monk's Lodge, which we inherited from him with the rest of his fortune. A while passed, and Emma was born. and it was when her mother was still confined to her room that one evening, as I was walking in front of the house after dinner, I saw a woman coming towards me carrying a 15-month child in her arms. There was something in this woman's figure and gait that was familiar to me, and I stood still to watch her pass. She did not pass, however. She came straight up to me and said, "How are you, George? You ought to know me again, though you won't know your baby." It was your mother, and Joan, you were that baby. "I thought that you were dead, Jane," I said, so soon as I could speak. "That's just what I meant you to think, George," she answered, "for at that time I had a very good chance of marrying out there in New York, and didn't want you poking about after me, even though you weren't my lawful husband. Also, I couldn't bear to part with the baby, though it's yours sure enough, and I've been careful to bring its birth papers with me to show you that it is not a fraud, and here they are, made out in your name and mine, or at least in the name that you pretended to marry me under." And she gave me this certificate, which, Joan, I now pass on to you. "The fact of the matter is," she went on, "that when it came to the point I found that I couldn't marry the other man after all, for in my heart I hated the sight of him, and was always thinking of you. So I threw him up and tried to get over it, for I was doing uncommonly well out there, running a lodging house of my own. But it wasn't any use. I just thought of you all day and dreamed of you all night, and the end of it was that I sold up the concern and started home. And now if you will marry me respectable, so much the better, and if you won't, well, I must put up with it, and shan't show you any more temper, for I've tried to get along without you, and I can't. That's the fact. You seem to be pretty flourishing anyway. Somebody in the train told me that you had come into a lot of money and bought Monk's Lodge, so I walked here straight. I was in such a hurry to see you. Why, what's the matter with you, George? You look like a ghost. Come, give me a kiss and take me into the house. I'll clear out by and by if you wish it." These, Joan, were your mother's exact words, as she stood there in the moonlight near the roadway, holding you in her arms. I have not forgotten a syllable of them. When she finished, I was forced to speak. "I can't take you in there," I said, "because I am married, and it is my wife's house." She turned ghastly white, and had I not caught her, I think that she would have fallen. "Oh, my God," she said, "I never thought of this. Well, George, you won't cast me off for all that, will you? I was your wife before she was, and this is your daughter." Then, Joan, though it nearly choked me, I lied to her again, for what else was I to do? "You never were my wife," I said, "and I've got another daughter now. Also, all this is your own fault, for had I known you were alive, I would not have married. You have yourself to thank, Jane, and no one else. Why did you send me that false certificate?" "I suppose so," she answered heavily. "Well, I'd best be off, but you needn't have been so ready to believe things. Will you look after the child if anything happens to me, George? She's a pretty babe, and I've taught her to say Daddy to nothing." I told your mother not to talk in that strain, and asked her where she was going to spend the night, saying that I would see her again on the morrow. She answered, at her sister's, Mrs. Gillingwater, and held you up for me to kiss. Then she walked away, and that was the last time that I saw her alive. It seems that she went to the Crown and Mitre, and made herself known to your aunt, telling her that she had been abroad to America, where she had come to trouble, but that she had money, in proof of which she gave her notes for £50 to put into a safe place. Also she said that I was the agent for people who knew about her in the States, and was paid to look after her child. Then she ate some supper, and saying that she would like to take a walk and look at the old place, as she might have to go up to London on the morrow, she went out. Next morning she was found dead beneath the cliff, though how she came there was nothing to show. That, Joan, is the story of your mother's life and death." "You mean the story of my mother's life and murder," she answered. "Had you not told her that lie, she would never have committed suicide." "You are hard upon me, Joan. She was more to blame than I was. Moreover, I do not believe that she killed herself. It was not like her to have done so. At the place where she fell over the cliff there stood a paling, of which the top rail, that was quite rotten, was found to have been broken. I think that my poor wife, being very unhappy, walked along the cliff and leaned upon this rail, wondering what she should do, when suddenly it broke and she was killed, for I am sure that she had no idea of making away with herself. After her death, Mrs. Gillingwater came to me and repeated the tale which her sister had told her, as to my having been appointed agent to some person unknown in America. Here was a way out of my trouble, and I took it, saying that what she had heard was true. This was the greatest of my sins, but the temptation was too strong for me, for had the truth come out, I should have been utterly destroyed. My wife would have been no wife. Her child would have been a bastard. I should have been liable to a prosecution for bigamy, and worst of all, my daughter's heritage might possibly have passed from her to you." "To me?" said Joan. "Yes, to you. For under my father-in-law's will, all his property is strictly settled first upon his daughter, my late wife, with a life interest to myself, and then upon my lawful issue. You are my only lawful issue, Joan, and it would seem, therefore, that you are legally entitled to your half-sister's possessions, though, of course, did you take them, it would be an act of robbery, seeing that the man who bequeathed them certainly desired to endow his own descendants and no one else, the difficulty arising from the fact of my marriage with his daughter being an illegal one. I have taken the opinions of 4 leading lawyers upon the case, giving false names to the parties concerned. Of these, 2 have advised that you would be entitled to the property, since the law is always strained against illegitimate issue, and 2 that equity would intervene and declare that her grandfather's inheritance must come to Emma, as he doubtless intended, although there was an accidental irregularity in the marriage of the mother. I have told you all this, Joan, as I am telling you everything, because I wish to keep nothing back. But I trust that your generosity and sense of right will never allow you to raise the question, for this money belongs to Emma, and to her alone. For you I have done my best out of my savings, and in some few days or weeks you will inherit about £4,000, which will give you a competence independent of your husband. You need not be afraid, sir, answered Joan contemptuously. I would rather cut my fingers off than touch a farthing of the money to which I have no right at all. I don't even know that I will accept your legacy. I hope that you will do so, Joan, for it will put you in a position of complete independence, will provide for your children, and will enable you to live apart from your husband, should you by any chance fail to get on with him. And now I have told you the whole truth, and it only remains for me to most humbly beg your forgiveness. I have done my best for you, Joan, according to my lights, for, as I could not acknowledge you, I thought it would be well that you should be brought up in your mother's class, though here I did not make sufficient allowance for the secret influences of race, seeing that, notwithstanding your education, you are in heart and appearance a lady. I might, indeed, have taken you to live with me, as I often longed to do, but I feared lest such an act should expose me to suspicion. Suspicion should lead to inquiry, and inquiry to my ruin and to that of my daughter Emma. Doubtless it would have been better, as well as more honest, if I had faced the matter out, but at the time I could not find the courage, and the opportunity went by. My early life had not been altogether creditable, and I could not bear the thought of once more becoming the object of scandal and of disgrace, or of imperiling the fortune and position to which after so many struggles I had at length attained. That, Joan, is my true story, and now again I say that I hope to hear you forgive me before I die, and promise that you will not, unless it is absolutely necessary, reveal these facts to your half-sister, Lady Graves, for if you do, I verily believe that it will break her heart. The dread lest she should learn this history has haunted me for years, and caused me to strain every nerve to secure her marriage with a man of position and honorable name, so that, even should it be discovered that she had none, she might find a refuge in her disgrace. Thank heaven that I, who have failed in so many things, have at least succeeded in this, so that, come what may when I am dead, she is provided for and safe. I suppose, sir, that Sir Henry Graves knows all this? Knows it? Of course not. Had he known it, I doubt if he would have married her. Possibly not. He might even have married somebody else, Joan answered. It seems, then, that you palmed off Miss Emma upon him under a false description. I did, he said with a groan. It was wrong, like the rest, but one evil leads to another. Yes, sir, one evil leads to another, as I shall show you presently. You ask me to forgive you, and you talk about the breaking of Lady Graves' heart. Perhaps you do not know that mine is already broken through you, or to what a fate you have given me over. I will tell you. Your daughter's husband, Sir Henry Graves, and I loved each other, and I have borne his child. He wished to marry me, though, believing myself to be what you have taught me to believe, I was against it from the first. When he learned my state, he insisted upon marrying me, like the honorable man that he is, and told his mother of his intention. She came to me in London and pleaded with me, almost on her knees, that I should ward off this disgrace from her family, and preserve her son from taking a step which would ruin him. I was moved by her entreaties, and I felt the truth of what she said. But I knew well that, should he come to marry me, as within a few days he was to do, for our child's and our love's sake, if not for my own, I could never find the strength to deny him. What was I to do? I was too ill to run away, and he would have hunted me out. Therefore it came to this, that I must choose between suicide, which was both wicked and impossible, for I could not murder another as well as myself, and the still more dreadful step that at length I took. You know the man Samuel Rock, my husband, and perhaps you know also that for a long while he has persecuted me with his passion, although again and again I have told him that he was hateful to me. While I was ill he obtained my address in London. I believe that he bought it from my aunt, Mrs. Gillingwater, the woman in whose charge you were satisfied to leave me, and 2 days after I had seen Lady Graves, He came to visit me, gaining admission by passing himself off as Sir Henry to my landlady, Mrs. Bird. You can guess the rest. To put myself out of temptation, and to save the man I loved from being disgraced and contaminated by me, I married the man I hated, a man so base that, even when I told him all, and bargained that I should live apart from him for many months, he was yet content to take me. I did more than this even. I wrote in such a fashion to Sir Henry as I knew must shock and revolt him, and then I married, leaving him to believe that I had thrown him over because the husband whom I had chosen was richer than himself. Perhaps you cannot guess why I should thus have dishonored both of us, and subjected myself to the horrible shame of making myself vile in Sir Henry's eyes. This was the reason. Had I not done so, had he once suspected the true motives of my sacrifice, the plot would have failed. I should have sold myself for nothing, for then he would never have married Emma Levenger. And now that my cup may be full, my child is dead, and tomorrow I must give myself over to my husband according to the terms of my bond. This, sir, is the fruit of all your falsehoods, and I say, ask God to forgive you, but not the poor girl, your own daughter, whom you have robbed of honor and happiness, and handed over to misery and shame. Thus Joan spoke to him, in a quiet and almost mechanical voice indeed, but standing on her feet above the dying man, and with eyes and gestures that betrayed her absorbing indignation. When she had finished, her father, who was crouched in the chair before her, let fall his hands, wherewith he had hidden his face, and she saw that he was gasping for breath, and that his lips were blue. The way of transgressors is hard, as we have both learned, he muttered, with a deathly smile, and I deserve it all. I am sorry for you, Joan, but I cannot help you. If it consoles you, you may remember that, whereas your sorrows and shame are but temporal, mine, as I fear, will be eternal. And now, since you refuse to forgive me, farewell, for I can talk no more, and must make ready, as best I can, to take my evil doings hence before another, and I trust a more merciful judge. Joan turned to leave the room, but ere she reached the door, the rage died out of her heart, and pity entered it. I forgive you, father, she said, for it is heaven's will that these things should have happened, and by my own sin I have brought the worst of them upon me. I forgive you, as I hope to be forgiven, but oh, I pray that my time here may be short. God bless you for those words, Joan, he murmured. Then she was gone. End of chapter 37.
Chapter 38 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 38. A Ghost of the Past. Lady Graves sat at breakfast in the dining room at Rosham, where she had arrived from London on the previous evening, to welcome home her son and her daughter-in-law. Just as she was rising from the table, the butler brought her a telegram. "Your master and mistress will be here by 11:30, Thompson," she said. "This message is from Harwich, and they seem to have had a very bad crossing." "Indeed, my lady," answered the old man, whose face, like the house of Graves, shone with a renewed prosperity. "Then I had better give orders about the carriage meeting them. It's a pity we hadn't a little more notice, for there's many in the village as would have liked to give Sir Henry and her ladyship a bit of a welcome." "Yes, Thompson, but perhaps they can manage something of that sort in a day or two. Everything is ready, I suppose. I have not had time to go round yet." "Well, I can't say that, my lady. I think that some of them there workmen won't have done till their dying day, and the smell of paint upstairs is awful. But perhaps your ladyship would like to have a look?" "Yes, I should, Thompson, if you will give the orders about the carriage and to have some breakfast ready." Thompson bowed and went, and, reappearing presently, led Lady Graves from room to room, pointing out the repairs that had been done to each. Emma's money had fallen upon the nakedness of Rosham like spring rains upon a desert land, with results that were eminently satisfactory to Lady Graves, who for many years had been doomed to mourn over threadbare carpets and shabby walls. At last they had inspected everything, down to the new glass in the windows of the servants' bedrooms. "I think, Thompson," said Lady Graves with a sigh of relief, "that taking everything into consideration, we have a great deal to be thankful for." "That's just what I says upon my knees every night, my lady, when I remember that if it hadn't been for the new mistress and her money, bless her sweet face, all of us might have been sold up and in the workhouse by now, or near it. I feel downright sick." "Well, you can cheer up now, Thompson, for, although for his position, your master will not be a rich man, the bad times are done with." Yes, my lady, they are done with, and please God they won't come no more in my day. If your ladyship is going to walk outside, I'll call March, as I know he's very anxious to show you the new vinery. Thank you, Thompson, but I think I will sit quiet and enjoy myself till Sir Henry comes, and then we can all go and see the gardens together. Mr. and Mrs. Millward are coming over this afternoon, are they not? Yes, I believe so, my lady. That is, Mrs. Millward, drove round with her husband yesterday to look at the new furniture in the drawing-room, and said that they should invite themselves to dinner tonight to welcome the bride. He's grown wonderful pleasant of late, Mr. Millward has, and speaks quite civil to the likes of us since Sir Henry's marriage. Though March, he do say it's because he wants our votes, for I suppose you've heard, my lady, that he's putting up for Parliament in this division. But then March never was no believer in the human heart. Yes, I have heard, and I am told that Miss Ellen will pull him through. However, we need not think of that yet. By the way, Thompson, tell March to cut a bowlful of sweet peas and have them put in your mistress's room. I remember that when she was here as a girl, nearly 3 years ago, she said that they were her favorite flower. When Thompson had gone, Lady Graves sat herself down near the open door of the hall, whence she could see the glowing masses of the rose-beds and the light shifting on the foliage of the oaks in the park beyond, to read the morning psalms in accordance with her daily custom. Soon, however, the book dropped from her hand, and she fell to musing on the past, and how strangely, after all its troubles, the family that she loved, and with which her life was interwoven, had been guided back into the calm waters of prosperity. Less than a year ago there had been nothing before them but ruin and extinction, and now it was not for herself that she rejoiced. Her hopes and loves and fears were for the most part buried in the churchyard yonder, whither ere long she must follow them, but rather for her dead husband's sake and for the sake of the home of his forefathers that now would be saved to their descendants. Truly, with old Thompson, she felt moved to render thanks upon her knees when she remembered that, but for the happy thought of her visit to Joan Haste, things might have been otherwise indeed. She had since heard that this poor girl had married a farmer, that same man whom she had seen in the train when she went to London, for Henry had told her as much and spoken very bitterly of her conduct. The story seemed a little curious, and she could not altogether understand it, but she supposed that her son was right, and that on consideration the young woman, being a person of sense, had chosen to make a wise marriage with a man of means and worth, rather than a romantic one with a poor gentleman. Whatever was the exact explanation, without doubt the issue was most fortunate for all of them, and Joan Haste deserved their gratitude. Thinking thus, Lady Graves fell into a pleasant little doze, from which she was awakened by the sound of wheels. She rose and went to the front door to find Henry, looking very well and bronzed, helping his wife out of the carriage. "Why, mother, is that you?" he said with a pleasant laugh. "This is first rate. I didn't expect from your letter that you would be down before tomorrow." And he kissed her. "Look, here is my invalid. I have been 20 years and more at sea, but till last night I did not imagine that a human being could be so sick. I don't know how she survived it. Do stop talking about my being sick, Henry, and get out of the way, that I may say how do you do to your mother." "Well, Emma," said Lady Graves, "I must say that notwithstanding your bad crossing, you look very well and happy." "Thank you, Lady Graves," she answered, colouring slightly. "I am both well and happy." "Welcome home, dear," said Henry, and putting his arm round his wife he gave her a kiss, which she returned. "By the way," he added, "I wonder if there is any news of your father?" "Thompson says he has heard that he is not very grand," answered Lady Graves, "but I think there is a postcard for you in his writing. Here it is." Henry read the card, which was written in a somewhat shaky hand. It said, "Welcome to both of you. Perhaps Henry can come and give me a look tomorrow, or, if that is not convenient, will you both drive over on the following morning? Yours affectionately, G.L." "He seems pretty well," said Henry, "but I'll drive to Bradmouth and take the 2 o'clock train to Monk's Vale, coming back tonight." "Ellen and her husband are going to be here to dinner," said Lady Graves. "Oh, indeed? Well, perhaps you and Emma will look after them. I dare say that I shall be home before they go. No, don't bother about meeting me. Probably I shall return by the last train and walk from Bradmouth. I must go, as you remember I wrote to your father from abroad saying that I would come and see him today, and he will have the letter this morning." After her interview with Mr. Levenger, for the first time in her life, Joan slept beneath her father's roof. Or rather, she lay down to sleep, since, notwithstanding her weariness, the scene through which she had passed, together with the aching of her heart for all that she had lost, and its rebellion against the fate which was in store for her on the morrow, made it impossible that she should rest. Once towards morning she did doze off indeed, and dreamed. She dreamt that she stood alone upon a point of rock, out of all sight or hope of shore, while round her raged a sea of troubles. From every side they poured in upon her to overwhelm her, and beneath the black sky above howled a dreary wind, which was full of voices crying to each other of her sins and sorrows across the abysm of space. Wave after wave that sea rolled on, and its waters were thick with human faces, or rather with one face twisted and distorted into many shapes, as though reflected from 1,000 faulty mirrors, now long, now broad, and now short, now so immense that it filled the ocean and overflowed the edge of the horizon, and now tiny as a pin's point, yet visible and dreadful. Gibbering, laughing, groaning, and shouting aloud, still the face was one face, that of Samuel Rock, her husband. Nearer it surged and nearer, till at length it flowed across her feet, halving itself against them. Then the one half shouted with laughter, and the other screamed in agony, and joining themselves together they rose on the waters of that sea, which of a sudden had grown red, and smiting her upon the breast, drove her down and down and down, into the depths of an infinite peace, whence the voice of a child was calling her. Then she awoke, and rejoiced to see the light of day streaming into the room, for she was frightened at her nightmare, though the sense of peace with which it closed left her strangely comforted. Death must be like that, she thought. At breakfast Joan inquired of the servant how Mr. Levenger was, and, being of a communicative disposition, the girl told her that he had gone to bed late last night, after sitting up to burn and arrange papers, and said that he should stop there until the doctor had been. She added that a letter had arrived from Sir Henry announcing his intention of coming to see her master after lunch. Joan informed the woman that she would wait at Monk's Lodge to hear Dr. Childs's report, but that Mr. Levenger need not be troubled about her, since, having only a handbag with her, she could find her own way back to Bradmouth, either on foot or by train. Then she went to her room and sat down to think. Henry was coming here, and she was glad of it, for, dreadful as such an interview would be, already she had made up her mind that she must see him alone, and for the last time. Everything else she could bear, but she could no longer bear that he should think her vile and faithless. Today she must go to her husband, but first Henry should learn why she went. He was safely married now, and no harm could come of it, she argued. Also, if she did not take this opportunity, how could she know when she might find another? An instinct warned her that her career in Bradmouth as the wife of Mr. Rock would be a short one, and at least she was sure of that, when once she was in his power, he would be careful that she should have no chance of speaking with the man whom he knew to have been her lover. But she could keep silence no longer. See him she must and would, were it only to tell him that his child had lived and was dead. Moreover, there was another matter. She must warn him to guard against the secret which he had learned on the previous night being brought directly or indirectly to the knowledge of his wife. Towards Emma her feelings, if they could be defined at all, were kindly, and Joan guessed that, should Henry's wife discover how she had been palmed off upon an unsuspecting husband, it would shatter her happiness. For her own part, Joan had quickly made up her mind to let all this sad history of falsehood and dishonor sink back into the darkness of the past. It mattered to her little now whether she was legitimate or not, and it was useless to attempt to clear the reputation of a forgotten woman who had been dead for 20 years at the expense of blasting that of her own father. Also she knew that if Samuel got hold of this story, he would never rest from his endeavors to wring from its rightful owner the fortune that might pass to herself by a quibble of the law. No, she had the proofs of her identity. She would destroy them, and if any others were to be found among her father's papers after his death, Henry must do likewise. When Dr. Childs had gone, about 1 o'clock, Joan saw the servant, who told her the doctor said that Mr. Levenger remained in much the same condition, and that he yet might live for another month or two. On the other hand, he might die at any moment, and, although he did not anticipate such immediate danger, he had ordered him to stay in bed, and had advised him to send for a clergyman if he wished to see one, also to write to his daughter Lady Graves, asking her to come on the morrow and to stay with him for the present. Joan thanked the maid, and leaving a message for Mr. Levenger to the effect that she would come to see him again if he wished it, she started on her way, carrying her bag in her hand. There were only 2 roads by which Henry could approach Monk's Lodge, the cliff road, and that which ran, through woodlands for the most part, to the Yale station, half a mile away. Joan knew that about 300 yards from the lodge at the end of the shrubberies there was a summer house commanding a view of the cliff and sea, and standing within 20 paces of the station road. Here she placed herself so as to be able to intercept Henry by whichever route he should come, for she wished their meeting to be secret, and for obvious reasons she did not dare to await him in the immediate neighborhood of the house. She came to the summer house, a rustic building surrounded at a little distance by trees, and much overgrown with masses of ivy and other creeping plants. Here Joan sat herself down and picked up a mouldering novel left there long ago by Emma. She held it in her hand as though she were reading, while over the top of it she watched the two roads anxiously. Nearly an hour passed, and as yet no one had gone by whom even at that distance she could possibly mistake for Henry, when suddenly her heart bounded within her, for 100 yards or more away, and just at the turn of the station road, a view of which she commanded through a gap in the trees and fence, she caught sight of the figure of a man who walked with a limp. Hastening from the summer house, she pushed her way through the undergrowth and the hedge beyond, taking her stand at a bend in the path. Here she waited, listening to the sound of approaching footsteps, and of a man's voice, Henry's voice, humming a tune that at the time was popular in the streets of London. A few seconds passed, which to her seemed like an age, and he was round the corner advancing towards her, swinging his stick as he came. So intent was he upon his thoughts or on the tune that he was humming, that he never saw her until they were face to face. Then, catching sight of a lady in a grey dress, he stepped to one side, lifting his hand to his hat, looked up at her, and stopped dead. "Henry," she said in a low voice. "What? Are you here, Joan?" he asked, "and in that dress? For a moment you frightened me like a ghost of the past." "I am a ghost of the past," she answered. "Yes, that is all I am, a ghost. Come in here, Henry. I wish to speak to you." He followed her without a word, and presently they were standing together in the summer house. Henry opened his lips as though to speak, but apparently thought better of it, for he said nothing, and it was Joan who broke that painful silence. "I have waited for you here," she began confusedly, "because I have things that I must tell you in private." "Yes, Mrs. Rock," he answered, "but do you not think under all the circumstances that it would be better if you told them to me in public? You know this kind of meeting might be misunderstood." "Do not speak to me like that, I beg," she said, clasping her hands and looking at him imploringly, then added, "And do not call me by that name. I cannot bear it from you, at any rate as yet." "I understand that it is your name, and I have no title to use any other." "Yes, it is my name," she answered passionately, "but do you know why? I know nothing except what your letters and your husband have told me, and really I do not think that I have any right to inquire further." "No, but I have a right to tell you. You think that I threw you over, do you not, and married Mr. Rock for my own reasons?" "I must confess that I do. You would scarcely have married him for anybody else's reasons." "So you believe. Now listen to me. I married Samuel Rock in order that you might marry Emma Levenger. I meant to marry you, Henry, but your mother came to me and implored me not to do so, so I took this means of putting myself out of the reach of temptation." "My mother came to you and you did that? Why, you must be mad." "Perhaps, but so it is, and the plot has answered very well, especially as our child is dead." "Our child?" he said, turning deathly pale. "Was there any child?" "Yes, Henry, and she was very like you. Her name was Joan. I thought that you would wish her to be called Joan. I buried her about a month ago." For a moment he hid his face in his hands, then said, "Perhaps, Joan, you will explain, for I am bewildered." So she told him all. "Fate and our own folly have dealt very hardly with us, Joan," he said in a quiet voice when she had finished, "and now I do not see what there is to be done. We are both of us married, and there is nothing between us except our past and the dead child. By heaven! You are a noble woman, but also you are a foolish one. Why could you not consult me instead of listening to my mother, or to anyone else who chose to plead with you in my interests and their own? If I had consulted you, Henry, by now I should have been your wife. Well, and was that so terrible a prospect to you? As you know, I asked nothing better, and it chanced that I was able to obtain a promise of employment abroad, which would have supported both of us in comfort. Or, answer me truly, Joan, did you, on the whole, as he told me, think you would do better to marry Mr. Rock?" "If Mr. Rock said that," she answered, looking at him steadily, He said what he knew to be false, since before I married him I told him all the facts, and bargained that I should live apart from him for a while. Oh, Henry, how can you doubt me? I tell you that I hate this man, whom I have married for your sake, that the sight of him is dreadful to me, and that I had sooner live in prison than with him, and yet today I go to him. I do not doubt you, Joan, he answered in a voice that betrayed the extremity of his distress. But the thing is so appalling that it paralyzes me, and I know neither what to do nor to say. Do you want help to get away from him? She shook her head sadly and answered, I can escape from him in only one way, Henry, by death. For my bargain was that, when the time of grace was ended, I would come to be his faithful wife. After all, he is my husband, and my duty is towards him. I suppose so. Curse him for a cringing hound. Oh, Joan, the thought of it drives me mad, and I am helpless. I cannot in honor even say the words that lie upon my tongue. I know, she answered. Say nothing. Only tell me that you believe me. Of course I believe you, but my belief will not save you from Samuel Rock, or me from my remorse. Perhaps not, dear, she answered quietly, but since there is no escape, we must accept the inevitable. Doubtless things will settle themselves sooner or later, and now there is another matter of which I want to speak to you. You know your father-in-law is very ill, dying indeed, and yesterday he telegraphed for me to come to see him from London. What do you think that he had to tell me? Henry shook his head. This, that I am his legitimate daughter, for it seems that in marrying your wife's mother he committed bigamy, although he did not mean to do so. Oh, this is too much, said Henry. Either you are mistaken, Joan, or we are all living in a web of lies and intrigues. I do not think that I am mistaken. Then briefly, but with perfect clearness, she repeated to him the story that Mr. Levenger had told her on the previous night, producing in proof of it the certificates of her mother's marriage and of her own birth. Why then, he burst out when she had finished, this old rogue has betrayed me as well as you. Now I understand why he was so anxious that I should marry his daughter. Did she know any of this, Joan? Not a word. Do not blame her, Henry, for she is innocent, and it is in order that she may never know that I have repeated this story to you. Look, there go the proofs of it, the only ones. And taking the 2 certificates, she tore them into 100 fragments and scattered them to the winds. What are you doing? He said. But it does not matter. They are only copies. It will be difficult for you to find the originals, she answered with a sad smile, for I was careful that you should see neither the name of the parish where my mother was married, nor the place of the registration of my birth. I will get those out of him, he said grimly, nodding his head towards the house. If you care for me at all, Henry, you will do nothing of the sort. For your wife's sake. I have been nameless so long that I can well afford to remain so, but should Lady Graves discover the secret of her birth and of her father's conduct, it would half kill her. That is true, Joan, and yet justice should be done to you. Oh, was ever man placed so cruelly? What you have said about the money is just, for it is Emma's by right, but the name is yours. Yes, Henry, but remember that if you make a stir about the name, attempts will certainly be made to rob your wife of her fortune. By whom? By my husband, to whose house I must now be going. For a few moments there was a silence, then Joan spoke again. I forgot, Henry. I have something to give you that you may like to keep, and she took a tiny packet from her breast. What is it? He said, shrinking back a little. Only a lock of the baby's hair, and she kissed it and gave it to him. He placed the paper in his purse calmly enough. Then he broke down. Oh, my God, he said with a groan. Forgive me, but this is more than I can bear. Another second, and they were sobbing in each other's arms, seeing nothing of a man, with a face made devilish by hate and jealousy, who craned his head forward to watch them from the shelter of a thick bush some few yards away. End of chapter 38. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Chapter 39 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Joan Haste by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 39. Husband and Wife. When Joan parted from Henry, she walked quickly to Monk's Vale station to catch the train. Arriving just in time, she bought a third-class ticket to Bradmouth and got into an empty carriage. Already they were starting when the door opened and a man entered the compartment. At first she did not look at him, so intent was she upon her own thoughts, till some curious influence caused her to raise her eyes, and she saw that the man was her husband, Samuel Rock. She gazed at him astonished, although it was not wonderful that she should chance to meet a person within a few miles of his own home, but she said nothing. "How do you do, Joan?" Samuel began, and as he spoke she noticed that his eyes were bloodshot and wild, and his face and hands twitched. "I thought I couldn't be mistook when I saw you on the platform." "Have you been following me, then?" she asked. "Well, in a way I have. You see, it came about thus. This morning I find that young villain Willie Hood driving his donkeys off my foreshore pastures, and we had words, I threatening to pull him, and he giving me his sauce. Presently he says, 'You'd be better employed looking after your wife than grudging my dickies a belly full of sea thistles, for as we all know, you are a very affectionate husband, and would like to see her down here after she's been traveling so long for the benefit of her health.' Then, of course, I asked him what he may chance to mean, for though I have your letter in my pocket saying that you were coming home shortly, I didn't expect to have the pleasure of seeing you today, Joan, and he tells me that he met you last night bound for Monk's Vale. So you see, to Monk's Vale I come, and there I find you, though what you may happen to be doing, naturally, I can't say." "I have been to see Mr. Levenger," she answered. "He is very ill and telegraphed for me yesterday." "Did he now? Of course that explains everything. Though why he should want to see you, it isn't for me to guess. And now where you might be going, Joan? Is it home sweet home for you?" "I propose to go to Moor Farm, if you find it convenient." "Oh, indeed. Well then, that's all right, and you'll be heartily welcome. The place has been done up tidy for you, Joan, by the same man that has been working at Rosham to make ready for the bride. She's come home today, too, and it ain't often in these parts that we have two brides homecoming together. It makes one wonder which of the husbands is the happier man. Well, here we are at Bradmouth, so if you'll come along to the Crown and Mitre, I'll get my cart and we'll drive together. There are new folks there now, your aunt's in jail and your uncle is in the workhouse, and both well suited, say I, though perhaps you will think them a loss." To all this talk and much more like it, Joan made little or no answer. She was not in a condition to observe people or things closely. Nevertheless, it struck her that there was something very strange about Samuel's manner. It occurred to her even that he must have been drinking, so wild were his looks and so palpable his efforts to keep his words and gestures under some sort of control. Presently they were seated in the cart and had started for Moor Farm. The horse was a young and powerful animal, but Samuel drove it quietly enough till they were clear of the village. Then he commenced to shout at it and lash it with his whip, till the terrified beast broke into a gallop, and they were tearing along the road at a racing pace. "We can't get home too fast, can we, darling?" he yelled into her ear, "and the nag knows it. Come on, Sir Henry, come on. You know that a pretty woman likes to go the pace, don't you?" And again he brought down his heavy whip across the horse's flanks. Joan clung to the rail of the cart, clenched her teeth, and said nothing. Luckily, the last half-mile of the road ran up a steep incline, and, notwithstanding Rock's blows and urgings, the horse, being grass-fed, became blown, and was forced to moderate its pace. Opposite the door of the house, Rock pulled it up so suddenly that Joan was almost thrown onto her head, but, recovering her balance, she descended from the cart, which her husband gave into the charge of a labourer. "Here's your missus come home at last, John," he said with an idiotic chuckle. "Look at her! She's a sight for sore eyes, isn't she?" "Glad to see her, I'm sure," answered the man. "But if you drive that there horse so you'll break his wind, that's all, or he'll break your neck, master." "Ah, John, but you see your missus likes to go fast. We've been too slow up at Moor Farm, but all that's going to be changed now." As he spoke, two great dogs rushed round the corner of the house baying, and one of them, seeing that Joan was a stranger, leapt at her and tore the sleeve of her dress. She cried out in fear, and the man, John, running from the head of the horse, beat the dogs back. "Ah, you would, Towser, would you?" said Rock. "You wait a moment, and I'll teach you that no one has a right to touch a lady except her husband," and he ran into the house. "Don't go, pray," said Joan to the man. "I am frightened," and she shrank to his side for protection, for the dogs were still walking round her growling, their hair standing up upon their backs. By way of answer, John tapped his forehead significantly and whispered, "You look out for yourself, missus. He's going as his grandfather did. He's allus been queer, but I never did see him like this before." Just then Rock reappeared from the house, carrying his double-barreled gun in his hand. "Towser, old boy, come here, Towser," he said, addressing the dog in a horrible voice of pretended affection that, however, did not deceive it, for it stood still, eyeing him suspiciously. "Surely," Joan gasped, "you are not going—" The words were scarcely out of her mouth when there was a report, and the unfortunate Towser rolled over onto his side, dying, with a charge of No. 4 shot in his breast. The horse, frightened by the noise, started off, John hanging to the reins. "There, Towser, good dog," said Rock with a brutal laugh. "That's how I treat them that try to interfere with my wife. Now come in, darling, and see your pretty home." Joan, who had hidden her eyes that she might not witness the dying struggles of the wretched dog, let fall her hand and looked round wildly for help. Seeing none, she took a few steps forward with the idea of flying from this fiend. "Where are you going, Joan?" he asked suspiciously. "Surely you are never thinking of running away, are you? Because I tell you, you won't do that, so don't you try it, my dear. If I'm to be a widower again, it shall be a real one next time." And he lifted the gun towards her and grinned. Then the man John having vanished with the cart, Joan saw that her only chance was to appear unconcerned and watch for an opportunity to escape later. "Run away?" she said. "What are you thinking of? I only wanted to see if the horse was safe," and she turned and walked through the deserted garden to the front of the house, which she entered. Rock followed her, locking the door behind her as he had done when Mrs. Gillingwater came to visit him, and with much ceremonious politeness ushered her into the sitting-room. This chamber had been redecorated with a flaring paper that only served to make it even more incongruous and unfit to be lived in by any sane person than before. And noting its gloom, which by contrast with the brilliant June sunshine without was almost startling, and the devilish faces of carved stone that grinned down upon her from the walls, Joan crossed its threshold with a shiver of fear. "Here we are at last," said Samuel. "Welcome to your home, Joan Rock." And he made a movement as though to embrace her, which she avoided by walking straight past him to the farther side of the table. "You'll be wanting something to eat, Joan," he went on. "There's plenty in the house if you don't mind cooking it. You see, I haven't got any servants here at present," he added apologetically, "as you weren't expected so soon, and the old woman who comes in to do for me is away sick." "Certainly I will cook the food," Joan answered. "That's right, dear. I was afraid that you might be too grand, but perhaps you would like to wash your hands first while I light the fire in the kitchen stove. Come here," and he led the way through the door near the fireplace to the foot of an oaken stair. "There," he said. "That's our room on the right. It's no use trying any of the others because they're all locked up. I shall be just here in the kitchen, so you will see me when you come down." Joan went upstairs to the room, which was large and well furnished, though, like that downstairs, badly lighted by one window only, and secured with iron bars, as though the place had been used as a prison at some former time. Clearly it was Samuel's own room, for his clothes and hats were hung upon some pegs near the door, and other of his possessions were arranged in cupboards and on the shelves. Almost mechanically she washed her hands and tidied her hair with a brush from her handbag. Then she sat down and tried to think, to find only that her mind had become incapable, so numbed was it by all that she had undergone, and with the terrors, mental and bodily, of her present position. Nor indeed was much time allowed her for thought, since presently she heard the hateful voice of her husband calling to her that the fire was ready. At first she made no answer, whereon Samuel spoke again from the foot of the stairs, saying, "If you won't come down, dear, I must come up, as I can't bear to lose sight of you for so long at a time." Then Joan descended to the kitchen, where the fire burnt brightly, and a beefsteak was placed upon the table ready for cooking. She set to work to fry the meat and to boil the kettle and the potatoes, while Samuel, seated in a chair by the table, followed her every movement with his eyes. "Now this is what I call real pleasant and homely," he said, "and I have been looking forward to it for many a month as I sat by myself at night. Not that I want you to be a drudge, Joan. Don't you think that. I've got lots of money, and you shall spend it. Yes, you shall have your carriage and a pair if you like." "You are very kind," she murmured, "but I don't wish to live above my station. Perhaps you will lay the table and bring me the teapot, as I think that the steak is nearly done." He rose to obey with alacrity, but before he left the room, Joan saw with a fresh tremor that he was careful to lock the kitchen door and to put the key into his pocket. Evidently he suspected her of a desire to escape. In a few more minutes the meal was ready, and they were seated tete-a-tete in the parlor. When he had helped her, Joan asked him if she should pour out the tea. "No, never mind that wash," he said. "I've got something that I've been keeping against this day." And going to a cupboard, he produced glasses and 2 bottles, one of champagne and the other of brandy. Opening the first, he filled 2 tumblers with the wine, giving her one of them. "Now, dear, you shall drink a toast," he said. "Repeat it after me. Your health, dearest husband, and long may we live together." Having no option but to fall into his humor or run the risk of worse things, Joan murmured the words, although they almost choked her, and drank the wine, for which she was very thankful, for by now it was past 7 o'clock, and she had touched nothing since the morning. Then she made shift to swallow some food, washing it down with sips of champagne. If she ate little, however, her husband ate less, though she noticed with alarm that he did not spare the bottle. "It isn't often that I drink wine, Joan," he said, "for I hold it sinful waste, not but what there'll always be wine for you if you want it. But this is a night to make merry on, seeing that a man isn't married every day," and he finished the last of the champagne. "Oh, Joan," he added, "it's like a dream to think you've come to me at last. You don't know how much I've longed for you all these months, and now you are mine, my own beautiful Joan, for those whom God has joined together no man can put asunder, however much they may try. I kept my oath to you faithful, didn't I, Joan? And now it's your turn to keep yours to me. You remember what you swore, that you would be a true and good wife to me, and that you wouldn't see nothing of that villain who deceived you. I suppose that you haven't seen him during all these months, Joan?" "If you mean Sir Henry Graves," she answered, "I met him today as I walked to Monksville station." "Did you now?" he said with a curious writhing of the lips. "That's strange, isn't it, that you should happen to go to Monk's Lodge without saying nothing to your husband about it, and that there you should happen to meet him within a few hours of his getting back to England? I suppose you didn't speak to him, did you?" "I spoke a few words." "Ah, a few words. Well, that was wrong of you, Joan, for it's against your oath. But I dare say that they were to tell him just to keep clear in future?" Joan nodded, for she dared not trust herself to speak. "Well then, that's all right, and he's done with. And now, Joan, as we've finished supper, you come here like a good wife and put your arms round my neck and kiss me, and tell me that you love me, and that you hate that man, and are glad that the brat is dead." Joan sat silent, making no answer. For a few moments he waited, as though expecting her to move. Then he rose and came towards her with outstretched arms. Seeing his intention, she sprang from her chair and slipped to the other side of the table. "Come," he said, "don't run from me, for our courting days are over, and it's silly in a wife. Are you going to say what I asked you, Joan?" "No," she answered in a quiet voice, for her instincts overcame her fears. "I have promised to live with you, though you know why I married you, and I'll do it till it kills me, even if you are mad. But I'll not tell you a lie, for I never promised to love you, and I hate you now more than I ever did." Samuel turned deadly white, then poured out a glass of neat brandy and drank it before he answered. "That's straight anyway, Joan. But it's queer that while you won't lie to me of one thing, you ain't above doing it another. P'raps you didn't know it, but I was there today when you had your few words with your lover. He never saw me, but I followed him from Bradmouth, step for step, though sometimes I had to hide behind trees and hedges to do it. You see, I thought he would lead me to you, and so he did, for I saw you kissing and hugging. Yes, you who belong to me. I saw you holding that man in your arms. Mad, do you say I am? Yes, I went mad then, though mayhap if you'd done what I asked you just now, I might have got over it, for I felt my brain coming right. But now it is going again. Going. And Joan, since you hate me so bad, there's only one thing left to do, and that is—" and with a wild laugh he dashed towards the mantelpiece to reach down the gun which hung above it. Then Joan's nerve broke down, and she fled. From the house itself there was no escape, for every door was locked. So, followed by the madman, she ran panting with terror upstairs to the room where she had washed her hands, and shutting the door, shot the strong iron bolt not too soon, for next instant her husband was dashing his weight against it. Very shortly he gave up the attempt, for he could make no impression upon oak and iron, and she heard him lock the door on the outside, raving the while. Then he tramped downstairs, and for a time there was silence. Presently she became aware of a scraping noise at the lattice, and creeping along under shelter of the wall, she peeped round the corner of the window-place. Already the light was low, but she could see the outlines of a white face glowering into the room through the iron bars without. Next instant there was a crash, and fragments of broken glass fell tinkling to the carpet. Then a voice spoke, saying, "Listen to me, Joan. I am here on a ladder. I won't hurt you, I swear it. I was mad just now, but I am sane again. Open the door and let us make it up." Joan crouched upon the floor and made no answer. Now there came the sounds of a man wrenching at the bars, which apparently withstood all the strength that he could exert. For 20 minutes or more this went on, after which there was silence for a while, and gradually it grew dark in the room. At length, through the broken pane, she heard a laugh, and Samuel's voice saying, Listen to me, my pretty, you won't come out and you won't let me in, but I'll be square with you for all that. You shan't have any lover to kiss tomorrow, because I'm going to make cold meat of him. It isn't you I want to kill. I ain't such a fool, for what's the use of you to me dead? I should only sit by your bones till I died myself. I've gone through too much to win you to want to be rid of you so soon. You'd be all right if it wasn't for the other man, and once he's gone you'll tell me that you love me fast enough. So now, Joan, I'm going to kill him. If he sticks to what I heard him tell his servant this morning, he should be walking back to Rosham in about an hour's time, by one of the paths that run past Ramborough Abbey wall. Well, I shall be waiting for him there at the crossroads, so that I can't miss him whichever way he comes, and this time we will settle our accounts. Goodbye, Joan. I hope you won't be lonely till I get home. I suppose that you'd like me to bring you a lock of his hair for keepsake, wouldn't you? Or will you have that back again, which you gave him this day the dead brats? You know, you sit in there and say your prayers, dear, that it may please heaven to make a good wife of you. For one thing's certain, you can't get out. And he began to descend the ladder. Joan waited a while and then peered through the window. She believed little of Samuel's story as to his design of murdering Henry, setting it down as an idle tale that he had invented to alarm her. Therefore she directed her thoughts to the possibility of escape. While she was thus engaged, she saw a sight which terrified her indeed, the figure of her husband vanishing into the shadows of the twilight, holding in his hand the double-barreled gun with which he had shot the dog and threatened her. Could it then be true? He was walking straight for Ramborough, and swiftly walking like a man who has some purpose to fulfill. She called to him wildly, but no answer came, though once he turned, looking towards the house, threw up his arm and laughed. Then he disappeared over the brow of the slope. End of chapter 39. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Chapter 40 of Joan Haste. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Chapter 40. Full measure, pressed down, and running over. Joan staggered back from the window, gasping in her terror. Her husband was mad with jealousy and hate, and every other passion. She could see now that he had always been more or less mad, and that his frantic love for herself was but a form of insanity, which during the long months of their separation had deepened and widened until it obtained a complete mastery over his mind. Then, by an evil fortune, he had witnessed the piteous and passionate scene between Henry and herself, or some part of it, and at the sight the last barriers of his reason broke down, and he became nothing but an evil beast, filled with the lust of revenge and secret murder. Now he had gone to shoot down his rival in cold blood, and this was the end of her scheming and self-sacrifice, that she had given herself to a lunatic, and her lover to a bloody death. So awful was the thought that for a while Joan felt as though her own brain must yield beneath it. Then of a sudden the desperate nature of the emergency came home to her, and her mind cleared. Henry was still unharmed, and perhaps he might be saved. Oh, if only she could escape from this prison! Surely it would be possible for her to save him, in this way or in that. But how? If she could find any one about her, she might send to warn him and to obtain help. But this she knew was not likely, for nobody lived at Moor Farm except its master, and by now the laborers would have gone to their homes in the valley a mile away. Well, once out of the house, she might run to meet him herself? No, for then possibly she would be too late. Besides, there were at least 3 ways by which Henry could walk from Bradmouth: by the cliff road, by the fen path, or straight across the heath, and all these separate routes converged at a spot beneath the wall of the old abbey known as the crossroads. That was why Samuel had chosen this place for his deed of blood. As he had told her, he knew that if he came at all, his victim must pass within a few paces of a certain portion of the ruined churchyard fence. What then could be done? Joan flung herself upon the bed and thought for a while, and as she lay thus, a dreadful inspiration came into her mind. If she could get free, it would be easy for her to personate Henry. There upon the pegs hung a man's coat and hat, not unlike those which he was wearing that day. They were much of a height, her hair was short, and she could copy the limp in his gait. Who then would know them apart in the uncertain glimmer of the night? Surely not the maddened creature crouching behind some bush that he might satisfy his hate in blood. But so, if things went well, and if she did not chance to meet Henry in time to save him, as she hoped to do, she herself must die within an hour, or at the best run the risk of death. What of it? At least he would escape, for, whether or not her husband discovered his error, after all was over, she was sure that one murder would satiate his vengeance. Also, would it not be better to die than to live the life that lay before her? Would it not even be sweet to die, if thereby she could preserve the man she loved more than herself 1,000 times? She had made many a sacrifice for him, and this, the last, would be the lightest of them, for then he would learn how true she was to him, and always think of her with tenderness, and long to greet her beyond the nothingness of death. Besides, it might not come to this. Providence might interpose to rescue her and him. She might see him in time coming by the cliff road, or she might find her husband and turn him from his purpose. Oh, her mind was mazed with terror for Henry and torn by perplexities as to how she best might save his life, while there was no more leisure to search out a better plan. If she would act, it must be at once. Springing from the bed, she ran to the window and, throwing it wide, screamed for help. Her cries echoed through the silent air, but the only answer to them was the baying of the dog. There were matches on the mantelpiece. She had seen them, and, groping in the dark, she found the box and lit the candles. Then she tried the door. It was locked on the outside, and she could not stir it. Next, she examined the window place, against which the ladder that Rock had set there was still standing. It was secured by 3 iron bars, let into the brickwork at the top and screwed to the oaken sill at the bottom. Scrutinizing these bars closely, she saw that, although her husband had not been able to wrench them away, he had loosened the center one, for, in the course of many years, the rust of the iron mixing with the tannin in the oak had widened the screw holes, so that the water, settling in them, had rotted that portion of the sill. Could she but force out this bar, she would be able to squeeze her body through the gap and to set her feet upon the ladder. There was a fireplace in the room, and resting on the dogs in front of it lay a heavy, old-fashioned poker. Seizing it, she ran to the window and struck the bottom of the center bar again and again with all her strength. The screws began to give. Now they were halfway out of the decaying woodwork, but she could force them no farther with blows. For a moment Joan seemed to be baffled. Then she took refuge in a new expedient, thrusting the poker outside of the bar to the right, and the end of it inside that which she was seeking to dislodge. She obtained a powerful leverage and pulled in jerks. At the third jerk her hand came suddenly in contact with the sharp angle of the brickwork that rasped the skin from the back of it. The screws gave way, and the bar, slipping from the hole in which its top end was set, fell clattering down the ladder. Now the road was open, and it remained only for her to dress herself to the part. Half crying with the pain of her hurt and bleeding hand, quickly Joan put on the hat and overcoat, remembering even then that they were the same which Rock had worn when he came to see her in London, and, going to the window, she struggled through the 2 remaining bars onto the ladder. Reaching the ground, she ran through the garden to the heathland, for she feared lest the surviving dog should espy her and attack her. But no dog appeared. Perhaps the corpse of its brother that still lay by the gate kept it away. Now she was upon the heathland and heading straight for the ruins of Ramborough, which lay at a distance of about 3/4 of a mile from the house. The night was fine and the air soft, but floating clouds now and again obscured the face of the half-moon, that lay low in the sky, causing great shadows to strike suddenly across the moor. Her way ran past the meres, where the wind whispered drearily amongst the growing reeds, and the nesting wildfowl called to each other across the water. There was a great loneliness about the place. No living creature was to be seen, and, at the moment, this feeling of solitude weighed more heavily upon her numbed heart than the sense of the death that she was courting. The world was still with her, and its moods and accidents affected her as they had always done, but the possibilities of that other unrisen world upon whose brink she stood, and the fear of it, moved her but little, and she scarcely thought of what or where she might or might not be within an hour. Those terrors were to come. She was past the meres and standing on a ridge of ground that lies between them and the cliff. Before her, when the moon shone out, she could see the glimmer of the ocean, the white ribbon of the road, and the ruins of Ramborough showing distinctly against the delicate beauty of the twilight summer sky. On she went, scanning the heath and the cliff with eager eyes, in the hope that she might discover the man she sought. It was in vain. The place was empty and desolate, a home of solitude. At length she stood upon the border of the cliff road, and the abbey was in a line with her some 200 yards to the right. Here she paused a while, staring into the shadows and listening earnestly. But there was nothing to be seen except the varying outlines of the clouds, and nothing to be heard save the murmur of the sea, the stirring of the wind among the grasses, and now and again the cry of some gull seeking its food by night. Now it was, as she stood thus, that a great fear of death took her, and it seemed as though all her past life went before her eyes in pictures, full, every one of them, of exact and bewildering detail. For the most part these pictures were not pleasant, yet it chilled her to remember that the series might so soon be ended. At the least they were human and comprehensible, whereas what lay beyond might be inhuman and above her understanding. Also it came home to her that she was not fit to die. Until her child was taken from her, she had never turned much to religion, and of late she had thought more of her own cruel misfortunes and of her lost lover than of her spiritual responsibilities or the future welfare of her soul. She was minded to fly. She had escaped from her prison, and no law could force her to live with a madman. Why should she not go back to Monk's Lodge or to London to seek a new existence for herself, leaving these troubles behind her? After all, she was young and beautiful, and it was sweet to live, and now that she was near to it, the death which once she had so passionately desired seemed a grim, unfriendly thing. But then there was Henry. He was lost to her indeed, and the husband of another woman. Yet, if she deserted him now, what would become of him? His career was before him, a long and happy career, and it was pitiable to think that within some few minutes he might be lying in the grass, murdered for her sake by a wretched lunatic. And yet, if she offered herself up for him, what must be the end of it? It would be that after a period of shock and disturbance, his life would fall back into its natural courses, and surrounded by the love of wife and children, he would forget her, or at the best remember her at times with a vague, affectionate regret. No man could spend his days in mourning continually over a passionate and inconvenient woman, who had brought him much sorrow and anxiety, even though in the end she chanced to have given him the best proof possible of her affection, by laying down her life for his. Well, so let it be. Afraid or not afraid, she would offer what she had, and the gift must be valued according to its worth in the eyes of him to whom it was given. Existence was a tangle which she had been quite unable to loose, and now, although her dread was deep, she was willing that death should cut its knot, for here she had no hope, and, unless it pleased fate that it should be otherwise, to death she would consign herself. All these thoughts and many others passed through her mind in that brief minute, while, tossed between love and terror, Joan stood to search the landscape and recover her breath. Then, with one last glance over the moorland, she stepped onto the road and began to walk slowly towards the abbey. 50 yards away the three paths met, but the ground lay so that to reach the crossroads, their junction, and to see even a little distance along the other two of them, she must pass the corner of the broken churchyard wall. Dared she do it, knowing that perchance there her death awaited her? Coward that she was, while she lingered, Henry might be murdered. Even now, perhaps this very instant, he was passing to his doom by one of the routes which she could not see. She paused a moment, looking up the main road in the hope that she might catch sight of Henry advancing down it, but she could perceive no one. An utter loneliness brooded on the place. Moreover, the moon at this moment was obscured by a passing cloud. For aught she knew, the deed was already done, only that she would have heard the shot, or perhaps Henry had driven to Rosham, or had gone by the beach, or the fit of homicidal mania had passed from her husband's mind. Should she go on, or wait there, or run away? No, she must reach the crossroads. She would not run. She would play the hand out. Of a sudden, a strange excitement or exaltation of mind took possession of her. Her nerves tingled and the blood drummed in her ears. She felt like some desperate gambler staking his wealth and reputation on a throw, and tasted of the gambler's joy. For a moment, under the influence of this new mood, the uncertainty of her faith became delightful to her, and she smiled to think that few have played such a game as this, of which the issues were the salvation of her lover and the hazard of her mortal breath. Now she began to act her part, walking forward with a limp like Henry's till she was opposite to and some 5 yards away from the angle of the churchyard wall. Here a swift change came over her. The false excitement passed away, and again she grew mortally afraid. She could not do it. The crossroads were now not 20 paces from her, and once there she might see him and save him. But never could she walk past that wall, knowing that behind it a murderer might be lurking, that every stone and bush and tuft of grass might hide him who would send her to a violent and cruel death. It was very well to make these heroic resolutions at a distance, but when the spot and moment of their execution was at hand, then the thing was different. She prayed God that Henry had escaped, or might escape, but she could not take this way to preserve him. Her mind was willing, but the poor flesh recoiled from it. She would call aloud to her husband, and reveal herself to him if he were there. No, for then he would guess her mission, render her helpless in this way or that. What chance had she against a madman? And afterwards do the deed. So it came to this, she must go back and wait upon the chance of meeting Henry on the cliff road, for forward she dared not go. Already she had turned to fly when her ear caught a sound in the intense silence, such a sound as might have been made by some beast of prey dragging itself stealthily towards its victim. Instantly Joan became paralyzed. The extremity of terror deprived her of all use of her limbs or voice, and so she stood with her back towards the wall. Now there was a new sound, as of something rising quickly through deep grass or brushwood, and then she heard the dull noise of the hammer of a gun falling upon an uncapped nipple. In a flash she interpreted its meaning. Her husband had forgotten to reload that barrel with which he shot the dog. There was still a chance of life for her, and in this hope Joan's vital powers returned. Uttering a great cry, she swung round upon her heel so swiftly that the hat fell from her face, and the moonlight passing from the curtain of a cloud shone upon her ashy face. As she turned, her eyes fell upon another face, the face of a devil, of Samuel Rock. He was standing behind the wall that reached to his breast, and the gun in his hand was levelled at her. A tongue of flame shot out, and in the glare of it, it seemed to her that his countenance of hellish hate had changed its aspect to one of agony. Then Joan became aware of a dull shock at her breast, and down she sank senseless on the roadway. Joan was right. Perceiving her from the crossroads knoll, his place of outlook, whence, although himself invisible, he commanded a view of the 3 paths, Rock, deceived by her disguise and assumed lameness, into the belief that his wife was Henry advancing by the cliff road, had crept towards her under the shelter of the wall to kill her as she stood. But in that last moment he learned his error too late. Yes, before the deed was done he tasted the agony of knowing that he was wreaking murder upon the woman he desired, and not upon the man she loved. Too late. Already his finger had contracted on the trigger, and the swift springs were at their work. He tried to throw up the gun, but as the muzzle stirred, the charge left it to bury itself in the bosom of his wife. Casting down the gun, he sprang over the wall and ran to her. She was lying on her back, dead as he thought, with opened eyes and arms thrown wide. Once he looked, then with yells of horror the madman bounded from her side and rushed away, he knew not whither. When Henry parted with Joan in the monk's lodge summer-house that morning, anger and bitter resentment were uppermost in his mind, directed first against his father-in-law, and next against his family, more particularly his mother. He had been trapped and deluded, and now, alas, it was too late to right the wrong. Indeed, so far as his wife was concerned, he could not even speak of it. Joan spoke truly when she said that Emma must never hear of these iniquities, or learn that both the name she had borne and the husband whom she loved had been filched from another woman. Poor girl! At least she was innocent. It must be his duty to protect her from the consequences of the guilt of others, and even from the knowledge of it. But Levenger, her father, was not innocent, and towards him he was under no such obligation. Therefore, sick or well, he would pour out his wrath upon him, and to his face would call him the knave and liar that he was. But it was not fated that in this world Mr. Levenger should ever listen to the reproaches of his son-in-law. When Henry reached the house, he was informed that the sick man had fallen into a restless sleep, from which he must not be disturbed. Till 9 o'clock that sleep endured, while Henry waited with such patience as he could command. Then suddenly there was a cry and a stir, and the news was brought to him that, without the slightest warning or premonition of immediate danger, Mr. Levenger had passed from sleep into death. Sobered and calmed by the shock of such tidings, Henry gave those orders which were necessary, and then started for home, where he must break the fact of her father's death to Emma. He had arranged to return to Bradmouth by the last train, but it was already gone, so he drove thither in the dog-cart that went to advise Dr. Childs and others of what had happened, and then set out to walk to Rosham half an hour or so later than he had intended. He might have hired a cart and driven, but being the bearer of this heavy news, naturally enough he had no wish to hurry. Moreover, he was glad of the space of quiet that a lonely walk by night afforded him, for he had much to think of and to grieve over. It was, he felt, a good thing that the old man should have died before he spoke with him, for though certainly he would have done it, there was little use in reproaching him with falsehoods and treachery, the results of which could not now be remedied. Poor Joan! Hers was indeed a hard lot, harder even than his own. It was a year this day, he remembered, since first he had met her yonder by the ruins of Ramborough Abbey. Who could know all that she had suffered during this eventful year, or measure what was left of her to suffer in the time to come? Alas! He could see no escape for her. She had entered on an unnatural marriage, but still it was a marriage, and she must abide by her bargain, from which nothing could free her except the death of her husband or of herself. And this she had done for his sake, to safeguard him. Ah, there was the bitterest part of it. While Henry walked on, chewing the cud of these unhappy reflections, suddenly from the direction of Ramborough Abbey, that was 1/4 of a mile or more away, there floated to his ear the sound of a single cry, far off indeed, but strangely piercing, followed almost instantly by the report of a gun loaded with black powder. He halted and listened, trying to persuade himself that the cry was that of some curlew which a poacher had shot out of season, only to abandon the theory so soon as he conceived it, for something in his heart told him that this scream was uttered by mortal lips, by the lips of a woman in despair or agony. A few seconds passed, and he heard other sounds, those of short, sharp yells uttered in quick succession, but of so inhuman a note that he was unable to decide if they proceeded from a man or from some wounded animal. He started forward at a run to solve the mystery, and as he went the yells grew louder and came nearer. Presently he halted, for there, from over the crest of a little rise in the road, and not 15 paces away, appeared the figure of a man running with extraordinary swiftness. His hat had fallen from him, his long hair seemed to stand up upon his head, his eyes stared wide in terror, and were ablaze with the fire of madness. His face was contorted and ashy white, and from his open mouth issued hideous and unearthly sounds. So shocking was his aspect in the moonlight that Henry sprang to one side and bethought him of the tale of the Ramborough goblin. Now the man was level with him, and as he went by he turned his head to look at him, and Henry knew the face for that of Samuel Rock. "Dead!" shrieked the madman, wringing his hands. "Dead! Dead!" And he was gone. Henry gasped, for his heart grew cold with fear. Joan had left him to join her husband. And now, what had happened? That cry, the gunshot, and the sight that he had seen all seemed to tell of suicide or murder. No, he would not believe it. On he went again, till presently he saw a lad running towards him who called to him to stop. "Who are you?" he gasped, "and what is the matter here?" "I'm Willie Hood, and that's just what I should like to know, Sir Henry," was the answer. "More especial as not 5 minutes since I thought that I saw you walking up to the Abbey yonder." "You saw me walking there? Rubbish! I have just come from Bradmouth. Did you see that man Rock run by?" "Yes, I seed him fast enough. I should say by the looks of him that he has been doing murder and gone mad. Half an hour ago, before you came along, or begging your pardon, someone as limped like you, he had a gun in his hand, but that's gone now." "Look here, young man," said Henry as they went forward. What are you doing here, that you come to see all these things?" "Well, sir, to tell the truth, I was driving my donkeys to feed on Rock's land, and when I saw him coming along with a gun, I hid in the bracken, for we had words about taking my feed this very morning, and he swore then that if he caught me at it again, he'd shoot me and the dickies too. So I lay pretty close till I saw the other man go by and heard the shriek and the shot." "Come along, for heaven's sake," said Henry. "That devil must have killed someone." Now they were near to the abbey wall, and Willie, catching his companion by the arm, pointed to a dark shape which lay in the white dust of the roadway, and in a terrified whisper said, "Look there! What's that?" Henry dashed forward and knelt down beside the shape, peering at its face. Then of a sudden he groaned aloud and said, "It is Joan Haste, and he has shot her." "Look at her breast," whispered Willie, peeping over his shoulder. "I told her how it would be. It was I who found you both a year ago just here and looking like that, and now you see we have all come together again. I told her it was a bad beginning and would come to a bad end." "Be silent and help me to lift her," said Henry in a hollow voice. "Perhaps she still lives." Then together they raised her, and at that moment Joan opened her eyes. "Listen, you," Henry said. "She's alive. Now run as you never ran before to Dr. Childs at Bradmouth, to the police, and anybody else you can think of. Tell them what has happened, and bid them come here as fast as horses can bring them. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Then go." Willie sprang forward like an arrow, and presently the sound of his footsteps beating on the road grew faint and faded away. "Oh, Joan, Joan, my darling," Henry whispered as he leant over her, pressing her cold hands. "Cannot you speak to me, Joan?" At the sound of his voice the great empty eyes began to grow intelligent and the pale lips to move, faintly at first, then more strongly. "Is that you, Henry?" she said in a whisper. "I cannot see." "Yes. How did you come thus?" "He was going to murder you. I passed myself off for you, at least I tried to, but grew afraid, and was running away when he shot me." "Oh, my God," groaned Henry. "To think that such a thing should have been allowed to be." "It is best," she answered with a faint smile, "and I do not suffer much." Then he knelt down beside her and held her in his arms, as once on a bygone day she had held him. The thought seemed to strike her, for she said, "A year ago tonight, do you remember? Oh, Henry, if I have sinned, it has been paid back to me the uttermost. Surely there can be nothing more to suffer. And I am happy because I think that you will love me better dead than ever you did alive. The way of the transgressors, the way of—" and she ceased, exhausted. "I shall love you now, and then, and always. That I swear before God," he answered. "Forgive me, Joan, that I should have ever doubted you, even for a moment. I was deceived, and did not understand you." Again she smiled and said, "Then I have done well to die, for in death I find my victories, the only ones. But you must love the child also, our child, Henry, since we shall wait for you together in the place of peace." A while went by, and she spoke again, but not of herself or him. "I have left Mrs. Bird in London some money. When Mr. Levenger is dead, there will be a good deal. See that she gets it, for they were kind to me. And Henry, try to shield my husband, for I have sinned against him, and hating him so much. Also tell your wife nothing, or you will make her wretched, as I have been." "Yes," he answered, "and your father is dead. He died some hours ago." After this, Joan closed her eyes, and bleeding inwardly from her pierced lungs, grew so cold and pulseless that Henry thought she must be gone. But it was not so, for when half an hour more had passed, she spoke, with a great effort, in so low a whisper that he could scarcely hear her words, though his ear was at her mouth. "Pray God to show me mercy, Henry. Pray now and always. Oh, 1 hour of love, and life and soul to pay," she gasped, word by word. Then the change came upon her face, and she added in a stronger voice, "Kiss me, I am dying." So he pressed his lips on her, and presently, in the midst of the great silence, Joan Haste's last sobbing breath beat upon them in a sigh, and the agony was over. 2 hours later, Henry arrived at Rosham to find his mother and Mr. and Mrs. Millward waiting to receive him. "My dear Henry, where have you been?" said Lady Graves. "It is 12 o'clock, and we were beginning to fear that something had gone wrong at Monk's Lodge." "Or that you had met with another accident, dear," put in Ellen. "But I haven't given you a kiss yet to welcome you home. Why, how pale you look! And what is the matter with your coat?" "Where is Emma?" he asked, waving her back. "She was so dreadfully tired, dear," said Lady Graves, "that I insisted upon her going to bed. But has anything happened, Henry?" "Yes, a great deal. Mr. Levenger is dead. He died in his sleep this evening." Lady Graves sank back, and Ellen exclaimed, "How dreadfully sad! However, his health was very bad, poor man, so it is something of a release. Also, though you won't care to think of such things, there will be advantages for Emma—" "Be silent, Ellen. I have something more to tell you. Joan Haste, or rather Joan Rock, is dead also." "Dead?" they both exclaimed. "Yes, dead, or to be more accurate, murdered." "Who murdered her?" asked Millward. "Her husband. I was walking back from Bradmouth and found her dying in the road. But there is no need to tell you the story now. You will hear plenty of it, and I have something else to say. Do you mind leaving the room for a moment, Mr. Millward? I wish to speak to my mother and my sister." "Edward is my husband, Henry, and a member of the family." "No doubt, Ellen, but I do not desire that he should hear what I have to say. If you feel strongly about the matter, I will go into the library with my mother." "Oh, pray don't trouble about me," answered Edward. "I am accustomed to this sort of thing here, and I shall only be too glad to smoke a cigar in the hall if Sir Henry does not object." And he left the room, an example which Ellen did not follow. "Now that we are quite alone, Henry, perhaps you will condescend to unbosom yourself," she said. "Certainly, Ellen. I have told you that this unhappy woman has been murdered. She died in my arms," and he glanced at his coat. "Now I will tell you why and how. She was shot down by her husband, who mistook her for me, whom he meant to murder. She discovered his plan and personated me, dying in my stead. I do not wish to reproach either of you. The thing is too fearful for reproaches, and that account you can settle with your own consciences, as I must settle mine. But you worked so, both of you, that loving me as she did, and feeling that she would have no strength to put me away otherwise, she gave herself in marriage to a man she hated, to the madman who tonight has slaughtered her in his blind jealousy, meaning to slaughter me. Do you know who this woman was, Mother? She was Mr. Levenger's legitimate daughter. It is Emma who is illegitimate, but she died begging me to keep the secret from my wife, and if you are wise, you will respect her wish as I shall. I have nothing more to say. Things have gone amiss between us, whoever is to blame. And now her life is lost, and mine is ruined." "Oh, this is terrible, terrible," said Lady Graves. "God knows that, whatever I have done, I acted for what I believed to be the best." "Yes, Mother," said Ellen boldly, "and not only for what you believed to be the best, but for what is the best. This unfortunate girl is dead, it seems, not through any deed of ours, but by the decrees of Providence. Henry says that his life is ruined, but do not grieve, Mother. He is not himself, and he will think very differently in 6 months' time. Also, he is responsible for this tragedy and no one else, since it springs from his own sin. Le désir accompli. You know the saying. Well, he has accomplished his desire. He sowed the seed, and he must reap the fruit and harvest it as best he may. And now, with your permission, Henry, I will order the carriage. I suppose that there will be policemen and reporters here presently, and you can understand that just at this moment, with the elections coming on, Edward and I do not wish to be mixed up in a most painful scandal." End of Chapter 40, read by Elsie Selwyn. End of Joan Haste, by H. Rider Haggard.